Hey guys, tonight we are going to leave the safety of the surface world behind. Imagine we are 5,000 meters below the surface. The pressure here is enough to crush a submarine. Around us there is only absolute black and perfect silence. But in that darkness, a faint light appears. It's a bioluminescent creature, a life form that exists in a way our ancestors on land could never have imagined. Over millions of years, it has evolved to hunt, to hide, to communicate with light. It has witnessed the rise and fall of other species, becoming a master of its eternal, sunless world. So what secrets do these creatures hold about the origin of life itself? Are there even larger monsters lurking in the abyss? And what would happen if we brought them to the surface? Thanks to state-of-the-art unmanned submersibles, tonight we will venture into these depths together to find the answers. Frankly, if you were dropped here without a submersible, you wouldn't survive a single second to realize where you went wrong. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm. That long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We aren't actually staying in the ocean tonight, but that feeling, that oppressive, silent darkness where light struggles to survive, is the perfect headspace for where we are going. We like to tell ourselves a very specific bedtime story about our species. We like to believe that human history is a straight, upward line, a nice, clean staircase. We started in caves, we figured out fire, we built some pyramids, we invented the steam engine, and then we landed on the moon. It feels inevitable. It feels permanent. We look at our skyscrapers and our internet and assume that once a civilization figures out how to be civilized, it stays that way. But that is a lie. The truth, the one that keeps archaeologists awake at night, is that history isn't a staircase. It's a series of mountains and canyons. And sometimes humanity falls off the mountain. Tonight we are looking at the canyons. We are looking at the Lost Epochs, the blackouts in the timeline where the lights went out, the writing stopped, and sophisticated, complex worlds simply dissolved into silence. To understand how far the fall can be, you first have to stand at the peak. So, let's travel back. You are standing on a dock in the harbor of Ugarit, on the coast of modern-day Syria. The year is 1200 BCE. The air smells of salt, drying fish, and the expensive perfume of cedar wood. You are living in the late Bronze Age. And frankly, life is good. In fact, life is modern. You might think of the ancient world as a bunch of isolated tribes banging rocks together, but looking around this harbor, you realize this is the first globalized economy in human history. To your left, a ship from Egypt is unloading papyrus and gold. To your right, a merchant from Mycenaean Greece is arguing over the price of olive oil. Behind you, a scribe is checking a clay tablet that catalogues copper ingots arriving from Cyprus. This world is tight. It's interconnected. The Hittite Empire in Turkey, the New Kingdom in Egypt, the Mycenaeans in Greece, and the Assyrians in Iraq. They aren't just neighbors. They are a system. They have trade treaties, extradition agreements for criminals, and royal intermarriages. They even have what you might call the Internet of Antiquity. It's called the Amarna Letters. In the ruins of an Egyptian city, we found hundreds of clay tablets that serve as the diplomatic email inbox of the 14th century BCE. And when you read them, you don't feel like you're reading ancient mystical texts. You feel like you're reading a passive-aggressive group chat between heads of state. They write to each other in Akkadian, the English of the day, calling each other "my brother." They complain about late shipments. One king writes to the pharaoh, basically saying, "You sent me gold statues, but they were hollow. Are you broke? Please advise." Another writes, "Why did you detain my messenger? He has been sitting in your lobby for 6 months." It's petty, it's bureaucratic, and it's deeply familiar. Historians still argue whether this interdependence was a strength or a weakness. But standing on that dock in Ugarit, it feels like strength. It feels invincible. You have massive palaces with indoor plumbing. You have a complex legal code. You have a specialized economy where a man can spend his entire life just painting octopuses on pottery because the system is efficient enough to feed him. But there is a fatal flaw in this golden machine, one you can't see from the harbor. It's the bronze itself. Bronze is an alloy. You need copper and tin to make it. Copper is easy to find. It's everywhere. But tin? Tin is the uranium of the ancient world. It's rare, and it's strategic. To get tin to the Mediterranean, it has to travel thousands of miles, likely from mines as far away as modern-day Afghanistan. Think about that supply chain. For the Egyptian army to have swords, a donkey caravan has to successfully cross the Hindu Kush, survive the Iranian plateau, navigate the politics of Mesopotamia, and arrive in the Levant without getting robbed. If that line breaks, the army doesn't just get weaker, the technology of the state stops working. But you aren't worried about that. The sun is shining on the white limestone walls of the palace. The king of Ugarit is secure on his throne. The trade winds are favorable. You have no idea that you are standing on the edge of a cliff. You have no idea that within a single lifetime, perhaps even within your own old age, every single palace you can see from this dock will be a smoking ruin. The writing system used to count those crates will be forgotten. The art of cutting these massive stones will be lost. The Lost Epoch isn't usually something that happens slowly. It arrives like a thief in the night. And for the people of the Bronze Age, the thief is already on the horizon, waiting for the first domino to fall. The truly terrifying thing about the end of the world is how fast it happens. We tend to think of the fall of civilizations as this slow, romantic melancholy, columns gently crumbling over centuries, while philosophers write sad poems about the decline. But the Bronze Age didn't gently decline. It crashed. It slammed into a wall at 100 miles an hour. If you were born around 1200 BCE, the world was stable, rich, and orderly. By the time you were an adult, the world was on fire. By the time you were old, the world was gone. In a span of roughly 40 to 50 years, one single human lifetime, every major city between Greece and Gaza was destroyed, and never occupied again. We know this because of what archaeologists call destruction layers. When you dig down into the earth at sites like Hattusa, the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey, you don't just find broken pottery. You find a thick, black band of ash. And inside that ash, you find something that shouldn't exist. Vitrified stone. The fire that consumed Hattusa was so intense, so hot, and burned for so long that the mud brick and limestone walls literally melted and turned into green glass. This wasn't an accidental kitchen fire. This was a systematic, extermination-level event. Someone piled brush against the walls, lit it, and didn't stop until the city was erased. So who held the torch? The Egyptians, who were the only ones to really survive this apocalypse to write about it, gave them a name that sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. The Sea Peoples. It's a vague, ominous title, isn't it? The Sea Peoples. In the Egyptian records, they are broken down into specific tribes: the Sherden, the Shekelesh, the Peliset, the Cheker. But names on a wall don't capture the sheer horror of seeing them appear on the horizon. Imagine standing on that same dock in Ugarit. You look out at the Mediterranean, expecting the familiar merchant ships from Cyprus. Instead, you see a swarm. And it's not just a navy. If it were just warships, you might understand it. This is a migration. The carvings at the temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt show us exactly what this looked like. Yes, there are tall warriors with horned helmets and round shields, but behind them are ox carts. And in the ox carts are women and children. This isn't just an invading army looking for plunder. This is a moving nation. It's a floating city of desperate armed refugees who have burned their own homes behind them and are now looking for yours. The pharaoh Ramesses III defeated them, barely. He carved a massive inscription celebrating his victory, claiming, "No land could stand before their arms. They laid their hands upon the land as far as the circle of the earth." It's a boast, sure, but you can feel the sweat in the stone. He's describing a tidal wave that swallowed the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Cypriots, and only broke when it hit the Nile Delta. Historians still argue fiercely about who these people actually were. Were the Peliset actually the Philistines of the Bible? Were the Sherden from Sardinia? Did the Shekelesh give their name to Sicily? We see their footprints in the linguistics, but they have no homeland in the record. They appear out of the mist, destroy the world, and then blend into the populations they conquered. But here is the darker question, the one that shifts the perspective. Were the Sea Peoples the murderers of civilization, or were they just its executioners? Modern scholars increasingly view them not as a coordinated empire of evil, but as victims of a different disaster. They were likely fleeing famine, drought, or their own collapse further north. They were a domino that fell and crushed the next domino. They didn't necessarily want to burn the world, they just wanted to eat. And when 1 million hungry people with swords show up at your gates, and your gates are locked, the walls are going to come down. The most haunting piece of evidence from this entire epoch isn't a weapon or a wall. It's a clay tablet found in the ruins of Ugarit. It was found inside a kiln. Think about what that means. A scribe wrote this letter, panicked and terrified, and put it in the oven to bake so it would harden and be ready to send. But it was never sent. The city was destroyed before the clay could even cool. The text reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lukka? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." It is a scream for help frozen in time. The writer is saying, "Our army is away helping our allies. We are defenseless." And then, the silence takes over. The next layer in the ground is ash. The complex, globalized world of the Bronze Age didn't just end, it was murdered in the kiln. So, if the Sea Peoples were the bullet that killed the Bronze Age, we have to ask, why was the victim so easy to shoot? Why did the entire civilized world shatter just because of a few bad years and a migration of angry refugees? The answer lies in a concept called systems collapse. And honestly, it's much scarier than any army of Vikings. It suggests that the Bronze Age didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was too efficient. Think about a house of cards. The higher you build it, the more impressive it looks, but the more unstable it becomes. The Bronze Age empires had built a towering structure of interdependence. Remember that tin we talked about? The stuff that had to be donkey-hauled from Afghanistan to make every single sword and spear in the Mediterranean. That wasn't just a luxury. It was a necessity. Imagine if, today, all oil shipments suddenly stopped. Not slowed down, but stopped. Within a week, the trucks stop running. Within 2 weeks, the grocery stores are empty because food isn't being delivered. Within a month, society is unrecognizable. That is exactly the vulnerability of the Bronze Age. The king of Mycenae didn't have tin mines in his backyard. He relied on a complex, handshake-heavy chain of middlemen stretching across the known world. If a warlord in Iran decides to tax the trade route too heavily, or if a boat sinks off the coast of Turkey, the assembly line of the entire military-industrial complex grinds to a halt. But it gets more personal than metal. The real killer was the specialization trap. In a primitive society, you grow your own wheat, you milk your own goat, and you survive. You are poor, but you are resilient. In a complex society, like theirs and like ours, we specialize. In 1200 BCE, you might be an olive farmer in Pylos. You don't grow grain, you grow olives, press them into oil, sell the oil to the palace, and the palace gives you grain that was imported from Egypt. It's an efficient system. It creates wealth. It allows for art and writing. But what happens when the ships from Egypt don't show up? You can't eat olive oil. You have barns full of a valuable cash crop, and your children are starving. The efficiency of the system becomes its death sentence. When the trade network snaps, everyone who isn't a subsistence farmer suddenly finds themselves obsolete and hungry. And the evidence suggests the trade network didn't just snap. The environment itself turned against them. For a long time, historians argued whether it was earthquakes or invasions that started the collapse. But recent science has given us a smoking gun, or rather a dusty one. Scientists have analyzed fossilized pollen from the bottom of ancient lakes in Cyprus and Israel. What they found in the sediment layers from around 1177 BCE is terrifying. Nothing. Or specifically, pollen from dry weather plants replacing the lush flora of the previous centuries. It indicates a mega drought that lasted not just a few years, but decades. So let's stack the deck. You have a climate shift that causes a famine. The famine pushes the sea peoples out of their homelands in search of food. These refugees cut the trade routes. The cut trade routes mean the olive farmer in Greece can't get grain. The starving farmer loses faith in the palace, which claims to be protected by the gods. The farmer burns down the palace. The palace stops sending soldiers to protect the trade routes. The trade routes collapse further. It is a feedback loop from hell, a multiplier effect, where 3 manageable problems combine to create one unmanageable apocalypse. This should sound uncomfortable to you. We live in a world of just-in-time delivery. We don't stockpile years of food or microchips. We rely on the ships arriving tomorrow. We rely on the fact that a factory in Taiwan will keep producing the chips that run our cars, our phones, and our hospitals. We are arguably more efficient, and therefore more fragile, than the Bronze Age ever was. The psychological toll of this collapse must have been shattering. You have to imagine the mindset of a person living through this. For centuries, the king was the intermediary between the gods and the soil. If the king was on the throne, the rain would fall. The bureaucracy was the safety net. When the systems failed, it wasn't just a political revolution, it was a theological crisis. The gods had clearly abandoned the world. The scribes, who spent their lives learning the complicated script to record tax receipts, suddenly found their skills were useless. You can't inventory ash. The specialized artisans, the perfume makers, the gold inlayers, they were the first to die, or the first to be enslaved. The machine of civilization stopped. And unlike a car, you couldn't just restart it. The parts, the people, the knowledge, the trade connections were scattered or destroyed. And so, the sun set on the glorious, golden, international world of the Bronze Age. And when it rose again, the world was smaller, darker, and much, much quieter. So the palaces burned, the trade routes were cut, and the refugees scattered. What happens next? You might expect a rebuilding phase. You might expect the survivors to sweep up the ash, elect a new king, and start shipping olive oil again within a decade. But that didn't happen. Instead, the lights went out. We call this period the Greek Dark Ages, and it lasted for roughly 400 years. From about 1100 BCE to 750 BCE, the archaeological record in Greece essentially goes dark. It is a profound, terrifying blackout in the human story. The most chilling casualty of this era wasn't the architecture or the art. It was the memory. Specifically, the loss of Linear B. Linear B was the writing system of the Mycenaean Greeks. It was a complex script used by scribes to track everything we just talked about: wool, grain, chariots, and slaves. It was the administrative backbone of the society. And when the palaces were destroyed, Linear B didn't just decline. It vanished. It became extinct. Think about the implications of that. You have a society that is literate, that can record its history and its transactions. Then, the infrastructure collapses. The scribes, who were highly specialized palace employees, either died or fled to the hills to become goat herders. A goat herder doesn't need to write down inventory. He doesn't need to send diplomatic letters. He needs to find grass and keep wolves away. So the fathers stopped teaching the sons how to write. Within 2 generations, maybe 60 years, the symbols on the old clay tablets lying in the ruins became meaningless scratches. Imagine walking through the ruins of Washington, D.C., a century after a collapse, picking up a hard drive, and having absolutely no concept of what it is or how to read it. To the survivors of the Greek Dark Ages, the clay tablets of their ancestors were just rocks. The Greeks literally forgot how to write. When writing finally returned to Greece centuries later, the alphabet we know today, it was a completely different system borrowed from the Phoenicians. The continuity was snapped. But the regression wasn't just intellectual, it was physical. If you dig through the layers of pottery from this time, it's heartbreaking. You go from the Mycenaean coin, beautiful, standardized, high-quality ceramics painted with intricate scenes of warriors and octopuses, to what archaeologists politely call sub-Mycenaean ware. Let's be less polite. It's garbage. It's handmade, lumpy, poorly fired, and decorated with shaky lines. It looks like the work of a child compared to the master craftsmen of the previous century. It is the physical evidence of a society that has lost its specialized tools, its kilns, and its aesthetic confidence. They weren't making art anymore. They were making buckets to hold water. The demographics paint an even bleaker picture. Estimates suggest that the population of Greece dropped by perhaps 75% during this period. That is a staggering collapse. It's the kind of number you associate with a nuclear war or a zombie movie. Large regions were depopulated entirely. The survivors clustered in small, isolated hamlets in the mountains, likely terrified of the sea that had brought the destruction. And in this isolation, something strange happened to their collective memory. They began to look at the ruins of their own ancestors with superstitious awe. If you go to Mycenae today, you can see the Lion Gate and the massive walls built of stones so large they weigh tons. We know, for a fact, that Mycenaean engineers built them using leverage, rollers, and manpower around 1250 BCE. But by 800 BCE, the Greeks living in the shadow of these walls had forgotten that humans were capable of such things. They looked at the massive blocks and concluded, men could not have lifted these. Giants must have built them. This is the origin of the term Cyclopean masonry. The classical Greeks, the philosophically advanced society of Plato and Aristotle, genuinely believed that a race of one-eyed monsters, the Cyclopes, had built the cities of the Bronze Age. They had become so disconnected from their own history that they mythologized their own great-grandfathers as monsters. History transformed into legend. The actual political struggles of the Bronze Age warlords, likely fighting over trade rights and tin access, were retold around campfires for centuries until they morphed into the Iliad and the Odyssey. Agamemnon and Achilles might have been real men, but the versions we have are memories filtered through 400 years of a game of telephone played in the dark. This is the ultimate lesson of the void. Knowledge is not a permanent inheritance. It is a fragile flame that requires oxygen and fuel. If the system that supports the knowers, the scientists, the scribes, the engineers, collapses, the knowledge doesn't just sit in a library waiting to be rediscovered. It evaporates. The people of the Greek Dark Ages didn't just lose their comfort. They lost the instructions for civilization. If the Bronze Age collapse was a car crash, sudden, violent, and fiery, then the fall of the Roman Empire was more like a slow, agonizing tire leak. It didn't happen on a Tuesday. There was no single moment where everyone looked at each other and said, well, that's it, we're barbarians now. We have this date etched in our history books, 476 CE. We are told this is when the Western Roman Empire fell. You might imagine a scene of apocalyptic destruction, with columns toppling and Huns rampaging through the Senate. But if you were actually standing in Ravenna on that day, watching the Germanic general Odoacer depose the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus, you might have shrugged. There was no fire. Odoacer didn't kill the boy. He gave him a pension and sent him to live in a villa near Naples. He didn't burn the city. He just packed up the imperial insignia, the crown, the robes, the scepter, and mailed them to Constantinople with a note that essentially said, "We don't need a separate emperor in the West anymore. One is enough." It was a whimper, not a bang, but the silence that followed was far more destructive than any explosion. Imagine you are living in the city of Rome 50 years after that fall. The city hasn't been nuked, but it is dying of neglect. The great machine of the empire is running in reverse. The first thing you notice is the water. For centuries, Rome was a hydraulic miracle. 11 massive aqueducts poured millions of gallons of water into the city daily, feeding the great public baths, the fountains, and the sewers. But aqueducts require maintenance. They need specialized engineers to clean the calcium buildup and fix the leaks. When the central government runs out of money, the engineers stop getting paid. When the engineers leave, the leaks start. One by one, the great aqueducts run dry. The baths of Caracalla, once a noisy, steaming social hub for thousands, fall silent and cold. The sewers stop flushing. The malaria-carrying mosquitoes return to the swampy lowlands. The city, which once smelled of perfumed oil and clean water, begins to smell of stagnation and wood smoke. The population collapse is even more haunting than the physical decay. At its peak, Rome held over 1 million people, a density not seen again until Victorian London. But without the massive grain dole shipments from North Africa, that population is unsustainable. By the mid-6th century, the population of Rome had plummeted to perhaps 20,000. Walk through the mental image of that. You are living in a city built for giants, but you are an ant. You occupy a single room on the ground floor of a crumbling 6-story apartment block. The upper floors are empty, the roofs caved in, home only to birds. The Roman Forum, once the center of the world's politics, is no longer a place of senators in white togas. It has become a grazing ground. In the medieval period, it was literally renamed the Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture. You walk past the rostra, where Cicero once gave thunderous speeches, and you see a goat chewing on weeds cracking through the marble pavement. This era saw the loss of one of history's most vital technologies, Roman concrete. This is a specific, scientific tragedy. Roman concrete, opus caementicium, was a marvel. It could set underwater and actually got stronger over time, thanks to a chemical reaction involving aluminum tobermorite. We still have Roman harbors today that are intact after 2,000 years of seawater. But the secret ingredient was volcanic ash, specifically pozzolana from the region around Naples. When the trade networks broke down, shipping tons of heavy volcanic ash up and down the coast became too expensive and too dangerous. Builders switched to local materials. They forgot the recipe. They stopped using the ash. Within a few generations, the buildings became weaker, the mortar crumbled, and the knowledge of how to build for eternity was lost. It wouldn't be rediscovered until a Swiss engineer found a copy of Vitruvius in a monastery library in the 1400s. For 1,000 years, humanity literally forgot how to glue rocks together effectively. The atmosphere of this zombie Rome is one of scavenging. You are living in the skeleton of a dead civilization, and you are surviving by eating the bones. This is literal, by the way. Throughout the city you would see smoke rising from small, crude kilns. What are they burning? They are burning the marble statues of the emperors. If you cook marble, calcium carbonate, at a high enough temperature, it breaks down into quicklime, which you can use to make a crude plaster for your hut. Historians still debate fiercely whether we should call this a decline or just a transformation. The so-called late antiquity theory argues it was just a cultural shift. But if you were a Roman watching a masterpiece sculpture of Augustus being smashed with a hammer and thrown into an oven just so your neighbor could whitewash his wall, it probably didn't feel like a transformation. It felt like the end of the world. The economy localized. If you can't import pottery from Tunisia, you make it yourself. But you aren't a potter. You're a survivor. So the pottery becomes rough and simple. If you can't import papyrus from Egypt, you stop writing letters. The world shrinks. The horizon, which once stretched to the borders of Scotland and Syria, now ends at the city walls. And the tragedy is that the people living in the ruins knew what they had lost. They were surrounded by monuments of a power they could no longer replicate, walking on roads they could no longer repair. Under arches they no longer understood. They were the inheritors of a kingdom of ghosts. As the physical stones of the empire were being cannibalized for lime, something even more precious was dissolving into the mud: the ability to read. We tend to view literacy as a basic human right, something that, once acquired, can never be lost. But for most of human history, literacy was a luxury technology. It was a tool, like a high-end computer. And in the chaotic centuries following the collapse of the Roman West, it became a tool that was too expensive to maintain. Put yourself in the shoes of a father in rural Gaul around 550 CE. Your grandfather might have been a minor bureaucrat who read Virgil and kept tax records. But the tax office is gone. The post office is gone. The courts are gone. There are no job openings for scribes. There are only openings for people who can swing a sword, or people who can harvest wheat. Do you teach your son to read? It takes years of study. It requires expensive materials. And at the end of the day, it won't put a single loaf of bread on the table. In fact, sitting inside reading a scroll when the harvest needs to be brought in might just get your family killed. So, you make a pragmatic, heartbreaking choice. You hand your son a plow instead of a stylus. And just like that, in one quiet generational transfer, the chain of literacy snaps. The consequences were catastrophic. We didn't just lose poetry and plays, we lost the user manuals for civilization. The Romans had books on everything. They had technical manuals on how to mix concrete, how to perform cataract surgery, how to survey a road, and how to construct a water mill. When the libraries of antiquity burned, or more often simply rotted away from neglect, that technical knowledge didn't just go offline, it was deleted. Archaeologists have a specific, grim name for the physical evidence of this deletion. They call it dark earth. If you dig under modern London, you will find the distinct red brick and tile layer of the Roman city of Londinium. Above that is the modern city, but sandwiched between them is a thick, black, amorphous layer of dark soil. It's a mystery layer. It contains no brick, no stone, no coins, no pottery. It is composed of centuries of organic waste, humus, rotted timber, manure, and thatch. It is the physical signature of a city that was abandoned and allowed to go feral. Inside this dark earth, the stratigraphy of history blurs. We can't tell 450 CE from 550 CE because there are no manufactured goods to date it. It is a black hole in the ground that perfectly matches the black hole in the written record. Nowhere was this collapse more brutal than in Britain. In Italy or France, the lights dimmed. In Britain, someone smashed the bulb. When the Roman legions left Britain around 410 CE, the province didn't just slide back. It free fell. Within a single generation, maybe 30 years, the entire infrastructure of Roman life evaporated. The villas were abandoned. The pottery wheel was forgotten. People literally went back to shaping clay by hand. The use of coins ceased entirely. Imagine the psychological impact of living in this landscape. You are an Anglo-Saxon settler arriving in Britain a few generations later. You come from a culture of wooden longhouses. You arrive in a place like Bath or London, and you see these titanic stone skeletons rising out of the mist. You see bathhouses with underfloor heating systems that look like dragon burrows. You see massive stone arches spanning rivers. You cannot conceive that human hands built these. You don't have the math, the machines, or the manpower to replicate them. So, you assume they are supernatural. There is a haunting Old English poem from this era called The Ruin. It was written by an anonymous poet looking at a Roman city, likely Bath, and trying to make sense of it. He writes, "Reitlich is this whalestan, weir de gebrekon. Wondrous is this wallstone, broken by fate." He describes the work of giants, enter Geveok, crumbling. He sees the red curved roof tiles and the bright bosoms of the bathhouses, and imagines a golden age of drinking and joy that was suddenly silenced. It is a rare, heartbreaking glimpse into the mind of someone living in the post-apocalypse. He isn't angry at the ruins, he is awestruck. He is walking through a graveyard of gods. Historians still argue about exactly why the written record is so thin here. Was it just that people stopped writing, or did the medium itself fail us? The answer is likely a bit of both, but don't underestimate the papyrus problem. The Roman Empire ran on papyrus imported from Egypt. It's a fantastic material, light, easy to write on, and cheap. In the dry sand of Egypt, it lasts forever. But in the damp, moldy climate of northern Europe, papyrus has the shelf life of a lettuce leaf. Once the trade ships from Egypt stopped coming, the supply of papyrus dried up. The only alternative was parchment, animal skin, which is incredibly durable but hideously expensive. To produce a single Bible on parchment, you might need the skins of 300 sheep. You don't use 300 sheepskins to write a grocery list or a diary. You use it for the Word of God and nothing else. So the casual everyday writing, the letters, the receipts, the gossip, vanished. The Dark Ages might not have been as dark as we think. They might have been full of thoughts and stories. But because they were written on biodegradable paper in a wet world, or simply spoken into the air, they are lost to us. We are left only with the silence of the dark earth. If the lights dimmed in the 5th century, by the 7th century, the room was pitch black. We are now entering the deepest part of the Dark Ages, roughly 600 to 800 CE. This is the void within the void. Historians often call these the invisible centuries in Western Europe. It is the period with the absolute fewest written records in the last 2,000 years. If you were to plot a graph of data density, the number of documents, inscriptions, and histories we have per decade, the line would crash in the year 600 and flatline for 2 centuries. It's a frustrating, tantalizing silence. We know people were there. We know they were living, loving, fighting, and dying. But they are ghosts. They left almost no names. Archaeologically, this era is a nightmare of subtlety. In the Roman period, you found stone villas, mosaic floors, and coins with dates stamped on them. In this period, you find post holes. That's it. Dark circles in the dirt where a wooden pole once rotted away. Imagine trying to reconstruct an entire civilization based on the stains left by rotting wood. We find thousands of these phantom settlements across Europe, small hamlets of timber and thatch that leave no trace above ground. We can see the layout of a house, maybe where the hearth was, but we have no idea who lived there. Was it a chieftain? A family of refugees? A local warlord? Without texts, we are forced to practice trash heap history. We sift through their middens, garbage pits, to find animal bones, broken combs, and loom weights. We can tell you what they ate, lots of pork and barley. We can tell you they had lice, we find the combs, and we can tell you they spun their own wool. But we cannot tell you what they believed, what songs they sang, or what they called themselves. There is a grim biological reason for some of this silence. Hovering over this entire period is the specter of the plague of Justinian. Starting in 541 CE, The bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same killer that would later cause the Black Death, swept out of Egypt and across the Mediterranean. It didn't just kill people, it emptied the landscape. Estimates suggest it may have killed up to 40% of the population of Constantinople in its first pass, and then it kept coming back, wave after wave, for 2 centuries. It is hard to write history when everyone who knows how to write is dead. The plague likely shattered the fragile monastic and administrative networks that were trying to preserve the Roman legacy. It turned the dark earth into a mass grave. But the darkness wasn't uniform. There were flickers of light, tiny candles burning in the gale. These candles were the monasteries. In isolated stone towers on the edges of the world, places like Skellig Michael off the coast of Ireland or Monte Cassino in Italy, monks were waging a desperate war against forgetting. They weren't fighting with swords, they were fighting with ink. The monastery became the bottleneck of human knowledge. Picture a single room, cold and lit only by tallow candles. A monk sits there, shivering, copying a text. He is the only reason we know anything about this era, but his resources are incredibly scarce. This scarcity led to one of the most tragic practices in literary history, the palimpsest. Parchment was expensive, so if a monk needed to write a prayer book or a copy of the Psalms, and he didn't have fresh skin, he would go to the library and find an old, useless book. He would scrape the ink off the pages, wash them, and write the new text over the top. The tragedy is what they considered useless. In 1229, a prayer book was finished. It sat in a library for centuries. It wasn't until modern scientists used multispectral imaging on the pages that they realized what had been scraped away to make room for the prayers. Underneath the religious text were the faint, ghostly diagrams of Archimedes. It was the Archimedes palimpsest. It contained mathematical proofs and calculus concepts that were lost to the world for 1,000 years. The monk didn't do it out of malice, he did it out of necessity. He needed a prayer book more than he needed a treatise on floating bodies. But that single act of scraping set mathematics back by centuries. How many other books were scraped away? How many plays by Sophocles? How many histories of the sea peoples? How many maps of the ancient world were erased just to write a laundry list or a hymn? We are looking at history through a keyhole. The monks preserved a lot. The Bible, the Church Fathers, some Latin classics. But their filter was selective. They saved what they thought was important for the salvation of the soul. Everything else, the pagan science, the barbarian history, the mundane details of daily life, was left to rot in the damp, or scraped away to make clean pages. So when you look at the dates, 600 to 800 CE, don't see it as an empty time. See it as a crowded room where someone has turned off the lights and taped over our mouths. The noise is there, the life is there, but the signal has been lost. Just as the lights were starting to flicker back on in the monasteries of Europe, a new shadow appeared on the horizon. This one didn't come from the decay of Rome, it came from the freezing mist of the north. The date is 793 CE. You are a monk on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of England. You are copying a gospel, feeling safe in your isolation. Then you hear it. The sound of wood grinding on sand. You look out the window and see ships that look like sea serpents. They are long, shallow, and fast. And the men jumping out of them are not here to discuss theology. This is the start of the Viking Age. For the next 3 centuries, these Scandinavians will fundamentally reshape the map of the world. They will conquer England, found Russia, the Rus, serve as the personal guard to the Byzantine emperor, and, most incredibly, beat Christopher Columbus to America by 500 years. But here is the paradox that drives historians crazy. The Vikings were one of the most active, dynamic cultures in human history, yet they were functionally mute. The Vikings did not write books. They had an alphabet, runes. But runes weren't designed for writing history. Runes are angular, made of straight lines because they were designed to be carved into wood or stone. You don't use a chisel to write a memoir. You use it to write, Ivar was here, or Thorwald owns this sword, or a brief magic spell. Because wood rots, most of their writing is gone. What we are left with are the runic stones, basically granite billboards boasting about a bridge someone built or a father who died abroad. It's like trying to reconstruct the entire history of the United States using only graffiti and tombstones. This creates a massive technological gap in our understanding, specifically regarding navigation. We know for a fact that the Vikings crossed the open Atlantic Ocean. This is an insane feat for open-decked wooden ships in the 10th century. They made it to Iceland, then Greenland, and then L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. But how? They had no magnetic compasses. They had no sextants. Historians and experimental archaeologists are still arguing about the Sunstone. The Norse sagas mention a solarstein, a sunstone that could locate the sun even on a cloudy, overcast day, which is basically every day in the North Atlantic. For a long time, we thought this was magic. But recent science suggests it might have been a crystal of Iceland spar, calcite. This crystal has a property called birefringence. It splits light. By rotating it, you can theoretically find the polarization of sunlight through thick clouds. If this is true, the Vikings possessed a piece of optical technology that the rest of the world wouldn't understand for nearly 1,000 years. But because they never wrote down the user manual, because the knowledge was passed from father to son on the deck of a ship, we aren't sure. The navigation software of the Viking Age died with the last navigator. The other problem with the Viking Gap is the enemy's pen. Almost everything we know about the Vikings comes from the people they attacked. We read the chronicles of English monks, Arab diplomats, and Frankish kings. Imagine if the only history of your life was written by the guy you punched in the face. It's not going to be an unbiased account. The monks described them as mindless, bloodthirsty demons sent by Satan. They didn't care about Viking trade routes or their legal assemblies. The thing. They cared about the fact that the monastery was burning. So we get a cartoonish, one-dimensional view of a complex society. And make no mistake, it was complex. When we dig into Viking settlements, we find evidence of a global reach that puts the Romans to shame. In a single Viking grave in Sweden, you might find silk from China, silver dirhams from Baghdad, and a small bronze statue of the Buddha from northern India. Think about the hands that Buddha statue had to pass through to get from India to a frozen fjord in Scandinavia in the 8th century. It implies a web of trade, diplomacy, and travel that is completely invisible in the written record. We see the object, but the story of its journey is lost. But wait, you might say. What about the sagas? Thor? Loki? Eric the Red? Here is the heartbreaking reality check. The Norse sagas were not written by Vikings. They were written by Christians in Iceland, 200 or 300 years after the Viking Age ended. Reading the saga of the Greenlanders to understand the actual discovery of America is like me writing a history of the American Revolution today, based solely on stories my grandmother told me. Is it true? Mostly, probably. The core events are likely real, and archaeology has confirmed some of them. But the speeches? The character motivations? The details? They are a mix of memory, fiction, and nostalgia. The Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with a merger. They didn't disappear. They assimilated. The Vikings in France became the Normans, who then conquered England. The Vikings in Russia became the Rus. The Vikings in England became, well, the English. They adopted Christianity, they started writing on parchment, and they stopped carving runes. They stepped out of the Lost Epoch and into the history books. But in doing so, they left the secrets of their golden age, the navigation, the true pagan rituals, the oral laws, drifting in the wake of their long ships, waiting for us to guess at them. We are going to shift our gaze now. We are going to cross that ocean the Vikings navigated, but we're going to look much further south, and a few centuries later. There is a myth you probably learned in school, or at least absorbed through pop culture. It's called the Pristine myth. It's the idea that when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they stepped into a virgin wilderness, a massive, empty Garden of Eden, where nature was untouched and a few scattered tribes lived lightly on the land. This is not just wrong, it is arguably the biggest lie in the history of geography. If you had flown a drone over the Americas in 1491, you wouldn't have seen an empty forest. You would have seen a hemisphere teeming with humanity. Modern estimates suggest there were up to 100 million people living in the Americas before Columbus. That is more people than were living in Europe at the same time. And they weren't just living in the jungle. They were building cities that rivaled anything in the old world. And the ghost of one of those cities is likely sitting right under your nose, especially if you live near St. Louis. It's called Cahokia. Around the year 1050 CE, while London was a muddy, disorganized town of about 10,000 people, Cahokia, on the banks of the Mississippi, was a booming metropolis of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 citizens. It was the largest city north of Mexico, and it wouldn't be surpassed in population in the United States until Philadelphia grew larger in the 1780s. Imagine standing in the center of Cahokia at its peak. You aren't in a forest. You are in a vast, engineered plaza, packed with thousands of people wearing vibrant fabrics, shell jewelry, and copper ornaments. The smell of wood smoke and roasting deer meat is everywhere. Dominating the skyline is not a cathedral, but a mountain. We call it Monk's Mound today. It is a colossal earthen pyramid, 10 stories tall, with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. And remember, the Cahokians didn't have beasts of burden. They didn't have horses or oxen. They didn't have the wheel. Every single cubic inch of dirt in that massive structure, millions of basket loads, was carried on the back of a human being. It was a feat of absolute devotion and centralized power. At the top of the mound lived the Great Sun, a divine king who looked down on his empire of wood and earth. Surrounding the city was a massive wooden palisade, a defensive wall made of 20,000 oak logs. They had wood henges, circles of cedar posts used as astronomical calendars to track the solstices. This was a complex, stratified, urban civilization. It had police, it had priests, it had garbage collection, sort of, and it had suburbs. And then it vanished. By the time Europeans really penetrated the Mississippi interior in the 1600s, Cahokia was a ghost town. Actually, it was less than a ghost town. It was a grassy hill. The wooden palisades had rotted away. The thatch houses were gone. The Great Sun was a memory so distant it had become a myth. What happened? We call it the vacant quarter. Around 1350 CE, the population didn't just decline, it evacuated. The leading theory is an ecological trap. The Cahokians were victims of their own success. To build that massive palisade and fuel those thousands of cooking fires, they cut down the forests upstream. Without the trees to hold the soil, the rain washed the dirt into the river. The river silted up, causing massive, unpredictable floods that destroyed their crops. At the same time, the stagnant water likely bred disease. The city became a trap. The great sun lost his mandate from heaven because he couldn't stop the floods. The social contract broke. But here is the Lost Epoch part that really stings. The cultural amnesia was total. When French explorers asked the local Native American tribes, the Illiniwek, who built these massive mounds, the tribes didn't know. They shrugged. They said, "They were here when we arrived." The link had been broken. The Cahokians hadn't just died. Their identity had dissolved. The survivors likely migrated, split into smaller groups, and simplified their society to survive, eventually becoming the tribes we know today. But the memory of the time when they built pyramids and ruled the river was lost to the silence of the grass. We walk over their history, quite literally, without knowing it's there. While Cahokia was rising in the humid green heartland of the continent, another impossible civilization was flourishing in the brutal red rock deserts of the American Southwest. If you drive through northwest New Mexico today, it feels like a place where humans are barely tolerated by nature. It is dry, hot, and unforgiving. Yet, if you turn off the highway and venture into Chaco Canyon, you find yourself standing in the ruins of a complex that defies the logic of survival. This was the domain of the ancestral Puebloans, often known by the Navajo word Anasazi, meaning ancient ones or ancient enemies. Between 850 and 1250 CE, they didn't just survive here, they engaged in a frenzy of monumental construction that we still can't fully explain. The centerpiece is Pueblo Bonito. The word pueblo makes you think of a small village. This was not a village. This was an architectural masterpiece. It was a single D-shaped building rising 4 or 5 stories high, containing over 600 rooms and dozens of circular ceremonial chambers called kivas. It was built with millions of pieces of sandstone, quarried from the cliffs and shaped by hand with stone tools. To give you a sense of scale, Pueblo Bonito was the largest apartment building in North America until the Spanish Flats were built in New York City in the 1880s. For 600 years, the title of tallest building in the US belonged to a stone palace in the middle of the New Mexico desert. But the mystery isn't just the building, it's the infrastructure. Radiating out from Chaco Canyon is a network of roads. These aren't just footpaths worn down by sandals. These are engineered highways. They are 30 feet wide, dug into the bedrock, and bordered with stone curbs. They run in perfectly straight lines for miles, ignoring the terrain. If a Chacoan road meets a cliff, it doesn't wind around it like a sensible trail. It goes up. They cut massive staircases into the sheer rock face to keep the line straight. Why? They had no horses. They had no wheels. They had no carts. You don't need a 30-foot wide highway to walk to the neighbor's house. This suggests that the roads weren't for transport. They were for theater. They were ritual lines connecting the center of the world to the sacred points on the horizon. They were processing routes for thousands of pilgrims coming to Chaco for reasons we can only guess. The Chacoans were also master astronomers. High on a butte above the canyon, there is a configuration of rock slabs known as the sun dagger. Through a precise interplay of light and shadow, a dagger of sunlight pierces a spiral petroglyph on the wall exactly on the summer solstice. They had turned the landscape itself into a clock. But around 1150 CE, the clock stopped. The construction ceased. The people left. But this wasn't a panicked flight like we saw in the Bronze Age. There are no signs of a massive invading army burning the place down. Instead, the abandonment of Chaco feels eerily orderly. In many of the great houses, the doorways were carefully sealed with stone and mortar. They didn't flee. They packed up. They closed the shop. They performed a closing ceremony, often burning the roof of the great kiva as a final act, and then walked away. Where did they go? They migrated south and east, merging into the populations that would become the modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples. The descendants are still here, but the system of Chaco, the centralized power, the tribute, the massive construction projects, dissolved. Why? The standard answer is drought. The Great Drought of 1276 CE is often blamed, but the decline started before that. Some archaeologists point to a darker possibility. In the final years of Chaco, there is evidence of violence that is deeply unsettling. We find bones with cut marks that suggest cannibalism, or at least the ritual mutilation of bodies. It has led to a theory that Chaco wasn't a benevolent religious center, but a terrifying theocracy that ruled through fear, and that the people eventually rose up, overthrew the priests, and walked away from the great house lifestyle forever. They voted with their feet. They chose to forget the complexity that had enslaved them. To the modern Pueblo peoples, Chaco is often a complicated place, a place of great power, but also of great imbalance. It serves as a reminder that sometimes a civilization doesn't fall because it fails. It falls because the people decide they don't want it anymore. They close the door, seal the kiva, and walk into the desert to find a simpler way to live. The collapse of Cahokia and Chaco Canyon feels mysterious because it happened before Europeans arrived with their pens and paper. But the greatest tragedy of the Americas, the Great Dying, is even more haunting because it happened while we were watching, but we looked away. Or rather, the observers arrived too late to realize they were walking through a graveyard. There is a terrifying phenomenon in the history of the Americas where the apocalypse traveled faster than the explorers. When we think of first contact, we imagine Columbus or Cortez shaking hands with a chief. We assume that moment represents the meeting of two healthy civilizations. But in many cases, by the time a European actually stepped foot in a village, the village was already dead. The germs, smallpox, measles, influenza, didn't need boats. They traveled along the native trade routes, carried by runners and merchants, infiltrating the interior of the continent decades before the first white man ever saw the Mississippi. The most chilling evidence of this comes from a comparison of two expeditions that visited the exact same region, but 140 years apart. In 1539, the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto landed in Florida and cut a brutal path through the American southeast. He was looking for gold, but what he found was people. His chronicles describe a landscape that was thickly settled. He marched through the province of Coosa, modern-day Georgia and Alabama, and described seeing large, fortified towns with defensive moats and wooden walls. He was met by chiefs carried on litters, surrounded by thousands of warriors. He saw fields of corn stretching to the horizon. De Soto was a monster. He brought war dogs, slave chains, and violence, but he was also a witness. He saw the twilight of the Mississippian culture. He saw a civilization that was still functioning, still organized, still powerful. But he also brought pigs. And with the pigs, and the men, came the breath of disease. De Soto died on the banks of the Mississippi, and his expedition fell apart. The Spanish didn't return to that region for a long time. Fast forward to 1682. The French explorer Robert de La Salle travels down the Mississippi River, passing through the exact same territory De Soto had described as a bustling empire. What did La Salle see? Silence. The great fortified towns were gone. The fields were overgrown with forest. The armies of thousands were nowhere to be found. Instead, La Salle found small, scattered bands of survivors living in simple huts. And most eerily, he found massive herds of bison grazing in places where De Soto had seen cities. The bison had moved in because the humans had vanished. In that 140-year gap, the Lost Epoch of the Southeast, a biological nuclear bomb had gone off. Epidemiologists estimate that diseases introduced by the Europeans killed 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas. Pause and really try to process that number. 90%. It is a statistic so high it becomes meaningless. So bring it down to your life. Look at your contact list on your phone. Count the first 10 people. Now, imagine 9 of them die in a month. Your parents, your siblings, your boss, the police, the doctors, the truck drivers, everyone. Society doesn't just change when that happens, it dissolves. If you lose 30% of a population, like the Black Death in Europe, civilization wavers but recovers. The survivors inherit the land and actually get richer. But if you lose 90%, the structure of reality breaks. The most devastating loss wasn't just the numbers, it was the specific type of people who died. In oral societies, the library is not a building. It is the mind of an elder. The history, the medical knowledge, the religious rituals, and the survival skills are stored in the memories of the old men and women. But disease hits the old and the weak first. When the smallpox wave hit a village, the elders, the libraries, were the first to burn. The survivors were often children or young adults who had not yet been initiated into the deeper secrets of their culture. They knew how to hunt, perhaps, but they didn't know the prayers that made the hunt sacred. They didn't know the full lineage of their ancestors. So the survivors of the Great Dying were not just traumatized, they were culturally lobotomized. They huddled together in new groups, merging tribes that had previously been enemies just to survive. They created new cultures, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee. But these were post-apocalyptic societies built from the fragments of the shattered Mississippian world. This created the widowed land myth. When English settlers finally pushed west into the Ohio Valley, or the Kentucky wilderness in the 1700s, they looked around and said, "Look at this beautiful, empty land. God has prepared it for us. It's a wilderness waiting to be tamed." They didn't realize they were looking at a garden that had just lost its gardener. The open meadows they loved? Those were cornfields that had gone fallow a generation ago. The easy paths through the woods? Those were trade routes kept clear by millions of feet that were now rotting in the earth. The gap here is a gap of conscience. We constructed a history of the American frontier that treated the land as virgin because admitting that we were colonizing a graveyard was too heavy a burden for the national mythology to bear. We forgot the cities De Soto saw, so that we could feel better about the cabins we built on top of them. If the forests of North America were a widowed land, the jungles of South America were a counterfeit paradise. For centuries, modern archaeology operated under a very stubborn assumption. The Amazon rainforest is a trap. The logic seemed sound. The soil in the Amazon is terrible. It's acidic, nutrient-poor, and constantly washed out by rain. You can't farm it. And if you can't farm, you can't build cities. Therefore, the Amazon must have always been a place of small, primitive hunter-gatherer tribes living lightly in the green hell. But there was one man who said otherwise, and for 400 years history called him a liar. His name was Francisco de Orellana. In 1541, he became the first European to navigate the entire length of the Amazon River, from the Andes to the Atlantic. It was a desperate, accidental journey. He was supposed to be looking for cinnamon, got separated from his main party, and just kept drifting downstream, hoping to survive. When Orellana returned to Spain, he told a story that sounded impossible. He claimed that the riverbanks were not empty jungle. He described cities that gleamed white, massive settlements that stretched for miles along the river. He reported seeing millions of people, fleets of war canoes, and sophisticated agriculture. Historians laughed at him. They said he was hallucinating from hunger or lying to get funding for another trip. Cities in the jungle? Impossible, they said. The jungle eats stone. The jungle eats people. Orellana is a fraud. So for centuries, the gap in Amazonian history was filled with our own arrogance. We assumed there was nothing there because we didn't think there could be anything there. Then, in the late 20th century, we found the dirt. It's called Terra Preta do Indio, Black Earth of the Indian. If you dig in certain parts of the Amazon, you don't find the pathetic, yellow, acidic soil that is natural to the region. You find deep, rich, black loam. It is incredibly fertile, and it is artificial. This soil didn't happen by accident. It was engineered. Thousands of years ago, the Amazonians figured out how to mix charcoal, pottery shards, bone, and manure into the soil to create a biochar that locks in nutrients and stays fertile for centuries. We have found patches of this engineered soil covering areas the size of small countries. This changed everything. It meant Orellana wasn't lying. The people he saw hadn't just adapted to the jungle. They had terraformed it. They had turned a green desert into a garden capable of feeding millions. But where were the gleaming white cities? Why didn't we find stone ruins like Machu Picchu? Because they didn't build with stone. There is no stone in the Amazon basin. They built with wood, bamboo, and earth. And in the most aggressive biological environment on Earth, wood doesn't last. If you abandon a wooden city in the Amazon, the termites eat the walls in 10 years, the vines crush the roofs in 20, and the forest swallows the rest in 50. The only way to see the ghosts of these cities is to strip away the forest. And recently, we finally did that, without cutting down a single tree. Using LIDAR technology, lasers shot from airplanes that can see through the canopy to the ground below, archaeologists in the 2020s have revealed a shock. Under the untouched jungle of Bolivia and Brazil, there are massive geometric earthworks. We are talking about perfectly square plazas, straight causeways connecting settlements, and defensive moats. We are seeing a network of garden cities, a decentralized urbanism where people lived in low-density clusters integrated with the forest, rather than packed into stone tenements. The scale is staggering. Some estimates now suggest the Amazon was home to 8 to 10 million people before Columbus. So what happened? The same tragedy that befell the Mississippi. Orellana was the first European to see them, and he was the angel of death. His expedition likely introduced smallpox and influenza to the river system. Because the Amazon is a single massive highway, the germs traveled fast. By the time the next Europeans arrived a century later, the gleaming cities were gone. The wood had rotted. The survivors had fled into the deep jungle, abandoning the riverbanks to escape the plagues and the Portuguese slavers. They forgot the technology of the Terra Preta. They became the small tribes we know today, the Yanomami, the Kayapo. We look at them and think they have always lived this way, in small bands, hiding in the forest. But they are likely the post-apocalyptic survivors of a fallen civilization, living in the ruins of a garden their ancestors built. It is a profound tragedy. We spent centuries trying to conquer and civilize the Amazon, burning down the forest to make cattle ranches that failed in 5 years because the soil was bad. All the while we were walking over the graves of a people who had already solved the problem, who had built a paradise and lost it, leaving only the black earth as a silent testament to their genius. We've seen civilizations that were burned, frozen, or diseased out of existence. Now let's travel to a place where civilization didn't just collapse. It simply evaporated. And it left behind a mystery so clean, so perfect, and so silent that it unnerves archaeologists to this day. We are going to the banks of the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. The time is roughly 2500 BCE. You know about ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the pharaohs, the gold. You know about Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, the wars, the kings. But huddled between them, and actually larger than both of them combined, was a third superpower, the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappans. At its peak, this civilization covered 1 million square miles. It had a population of 5 million people. And yet, until the 1920s, we didn't even know it existed. British railroad engineers in the 19th century actually used the ancient bricks from the ruins as ballast for their train tracks, not realizing they were crushing the remains of one of the world's first great cities. But when we finally stopped crushing the bricks and started looking at them, we realized something bizarre. Every single brick was the same size. I don't mean they were roughly similar. I mean they were standardized. Whether you were in the great city of Harappa, or in Mohenjo-Daro 400 miles away, or in a small trading outpost on the coast, the bricks followed a precise ratio of 1 to 2 to 4. This implies a level of bureaucratic control and standardization that shouldn't exist in the Bronze Age. It suggests a weights and measures department that spanned a territory twice the size of Texas. Let's walk through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro at its height. If you were a time traveler from 2500 BCE visiting from chaotic, organic Mesopotamia, walking into Mohenjo-Daro would feel like walking into a modern, planned community. The streets are laid out in a perfect north-south, east-west grid. The corners are right angles. The main boulevards are exactly twice as wide as the side streets. But the real shock is the smell, or rather, the lack of it. In almost every other ancient city, the streets were open sewers. In Mohenjo-Daro, the sewers are underground. They are lined with brick, covered with stone slabs, and engineered with manholes for maintenance. And inside the houses, you find toilets. Actual flush-style toilets connected to the central sewage system. You find private wells. You find bathrooms with tiled floors that slope to a drain. These people were obsessed with water. They didn't build a massive temple to a thunder god in the center of their city. They built a swimming pool. The Great Bath is the centerpiece of Mohenjo-Daro. It's a massive, waterproofed tank surrounded by changing rooms. It suggests that for the Harappans, cleanliness wasn't just hygiene. It was their religion. The ritual of washing seems to have replaced the ritual of sacrifice. But as you walk through this utopia of plumbing and grids, you start to notice what is missing. where is the palace? In Egypt, the pharaoh's palace dominates everything. In Mesopotamia, the king's ziggurat towers over the mud huts. In the Indus Valley, there is nothing. No palaces, no massive royal tombs filled with gold and sacrificed servants, no statues of gloriously conquering kings smiting their enemies. We have excavated thousands of graves, and they are surprisingly egalitarian. The rich and the poor seem to have lived relatively similar lives. There is very little evidence of extreme wealth inequality, and almost zero evidence of warfare. We have found almost no swords, no shields, no armor, and no depictions of armies. Who ruled these people? Who enforced the brick sizes? Who planned the grid? It is the greatest political mystery of antiquity. Some archaeologists argue that the Indus Valley was a civilization of merchants, ruled by a committee of guilds, a sort of Bronze Age corporate board. Others suggest a rigid caste system where religious purity, not wealth, defined your status, which would explain the focus on water and baths. But perhaps the most charming and baffling clue lies in what they left behind in the greatest numbers. They didn't leave behind statues of warriors. They left behind toys. We find thousands of terracotta whistles, carts with moving wheels, monkeys that slide down strings, and birds that nod their heads. This was a society that seems to have prioritized domestic happiness, child-rearing, and civic order over the glory of conquest. It feels like a peaceful, prosperous, boring paradise. A society that figured out how to live well without the need for tyrants or armies. And yet, despite all that order, despite all that modern infrastructure, they are the most silent of all the great ancestors. Because while we have their bricks, we cannot hear their voice. The silence of the Indus Valley is literal. We know they could write. We have the evidence in our hands. Thousands of small, square soapstone seals carved with exquisite skill. But for over 100 years, the smartest linguists, the most powerful computers, and the most obsessive code breakers have failed to read a single word. The Indus script is the Everest of undeciphered languages, and the reason we can't climb it is maddeningly simple. They never wrote a book, or at least not one that survived. Everything we have is short. The average inscription is only 5 symbols long. The longest one ever found is barely 20 symbols. Imagine trying to reconstruct the English language or the works of Shakespeare if the only evidence you had were license plates, coins, and stamps. You would have "In God We Trust," "E Pluribus Unum," and "Stop." You wouldn't have Hamlet. These seals are beautiful, by the way. They usually feature an animal, a humped bull, a rhinoceros, an elephant, or most famously, a creature that looks exactly like a unicorn. Above the animal is a line of symbols: fish shapes, jar shapes, stick figures. We call these seals because they were likely used to stamp clay tags on bundles of goods. They were the barcodes of the Bronze Age. A merchant from Mohenjo-Daro would pack a crate of cotton, slap a piece of wet clay on the knot, and press his seal into it. It said essentially, "Property of name," or "Checked by official." But because we don't have a Rosetta Stone, a bilingual text that translates Indus script into a known language like Sumerian or Akkadian, we are stuck guessing, and the guesses are wild. One camp of scholars argues that it represents a Proto-Dravidian language, the ancestor of the languages spoken in South India today, like Tamil. This would imply that the original inhabitants of North India were pushed south later on. Another camp argues it's related to Indo-European or Sanskrit. But there is a third, more disturbing theory. What if it's not a language at all? Some researchers argue that the symbols are like heraldry or traffic signs. When you see a red octagon, you know it means stop, but you don't read it phonetically. When you see a Nike swoosh, you know the brand, but the swoosh doesn't have a sound. What if the Indus script is just a system of corporate logos and religious icons? A visual shorthand that transcended spoken language so that traders from different tribes could understand it. If that's true, we will never read it, because there is nothing to read. There is one tantalizing artifact that hints at something more, though. It was found at the city of Dolavira. Most inscriptions are tiny, meant for personal inspection. But at Dolavira, archaeologists found what looks like a massive signboard that had fallen from above a gateway. It consisted of 10 large symbols, each made of white gypsum paste set into wood. The wood had rotted, but the white letters remained in the dirt. It was huge. It was meant to be seen from a distance. What did it say? Welcome to Dolavira, city of purity. Keep out? We have no idea. We are staring at a billboard from 4,000 years ago, and we are illiterate. The frustration is compounded by the imagery on the seals. One famous seal shows a figure sitting in a yogic lotus position, wearing a horned headdress, surrounded by animals. We call him Proto-Shiva because he looks uncannily like the later Hindu god Shiva in his aspect as Pashupati, the lord of beasts. Is this proof of continuity? Did the religion of the Indus Valley survive the collapse and morph into Hinduism? Is the yoga practiced in studios in Los Angeles today a direct descendant of a ritual performed in Mohenjo-Daro 5,000 years ago? It's a beautiful thought, but without the words, it's just a picture. We can see their gods, we can hold their toys, and we can walk their streets, but we cannot know their names. They are a civilization of strangers. Around 1900 BCE, the clockwork precision of the Indus Valley began to slip. It wasn't a sudden explosion like the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean. It was a slow, agonizing deterioration. If you look at the archaeological layers from this period, you can see the discipline breaking down. The standard brick ratio, that 1:2:4 formula that had held the civilization together for 7 centuries, starts to vary. The grand public drains get clogged and are built over by shoddy, private houses. The zoning laws of the great grid cities are ignored. People start dumping trash in the streets. The city as an idea was dying. But why? For a long time, historians blamed an invasion. They pointed to the Vedas, the ancient holy texts of India, which describe the god Indra destroying fortresses. They assumed that the Aryans, nomadic horsemen from the north, swept down and slaughtered the peaceful, bath-loving Harappans. But the skeletons tell a different story. We don't find mass graves full of people with sword wounds in the late layers of Mohenjo-Daro. We find people dying of malaria, anemia, and neglect. The killer wasn't a warrior, it was the weather. The Indus Valley Civilization was a child of the monsoons. Its entire agricultural system relied on the predictable rains. But around 2000 BCE, the global climate shifted. The monsoons weakened. The rains became erratic. And then, a catastrophe struck that was geologically inevitable, but civilizationally fatal. The river moved. Satellite imagery has revealed the dry bed of a massive ancient river running parallel to the Indus, often identified as the legendary Saraswati River mentioned in the Rig Veda. This river was the lifeline for hundreds of Harappan settlements. But due to tectonic shifts in the Himalayas, the water that fed this river was diverted into the Ganges or the Indus systems. The Saraswati didn't just dry up, it vanished. Imagine living in a city that exists solely because of a river. Then, year by year, the river gets thinner. The docks are suddenly a mile from the water, then 5 miles. Then there is only dust. The Harappans didn't just sit there and die. They adapted. But their adaptation meant the end of their civilization. You cannot support a massive, specialized city like Mohenjo-Daro without a surplus of grain. When the river failed, the surplus vanished. So, the people voted with their feet. They initiated a massive de-urbanization. They abandoned the great cities and moved east, toward the Ganges basin, breaking up into small, rural villages. This is the key to understanding the gap. The people didn't disappear. The culture didn't disappear, as we suspect with the yoga and the cows. But the complexity disappeared. When you move from a city of 40,000 to a village of 100, you don't need a sewage system. You don't need a standardized system of weights to trade with Mesopotamia. You don't need a script to record taxes. So the Indus script died because it was no longer useful. It was a tool of the urban elite, and the urban elite was gone. The knowledge of how to build flush toilets was lost. The memory of the great grid cities faded into legend. When the Indo-Aryan speakers arrived, or rose to prominence, around 1500 BCE, they encountered these mounds of the dead. They likely met the descendants of the Harappans, now living as simple farmers. They saw the ruins of the great brick fortresses and wondered who built them. There is a profound disconnect here. The Vedic Gap. The foundational texts of Hinduism, the Vedas, were composed in this period, but they describe a world of cattle herders and chariots, not a world of brick cities and sewers. The memory of the Harappan grandeur was not integrated into the new history. It was forgotten. The Harappans prove that you can be successful, peaceful, and technically advanced for 2,000 years, and still be erased if the river decides to change its course. They remind us that civilization is not a conquest of nature, it is a negotiation. And when nature stops negotiating, the city stops existing. We have a bad habit in the West of confusing history with paperwork. If a civilization didn't write down its tax receipts on parchment or carve its victories into stone, we tend to label it prehistoric or primitive. We assume that because there is no book, there was no story. Nowhere has this bias done more damage than in Africa. For centuries, European historians looked at sub-Saharan Africa and saw a blank space. They claimed it was a continent without history. But the history was there. It just wasn't written in ink. It was written in the mind. This is the tradition of the Griot. In West Africa, history wasn't a dead thing stored in a library. It was a living thing carried by a specific caste of people. A griot, or jelly, was a walking archive. From a young age, they were trained to memorize the genealogies of kings, the outcomes of battles, the laws of the land, and the epic poems of their ancestors. We aren't talking about memorizing a few nursery rhymes. We are talking about memorizing thousands of lines of verse, perfectly preserved and passed down for centuries. When a griot spoke, he was channeling the voices of 20 generations. But this system has a terrifying vulnerability. As the Malian writer Amadou Hampâté Bâ famously said, "In Africa, when an old man dies, it is a library burning." Now imagine the scale of the arson that occurred during the transatlantic slave trade. When millions of people were stolen from their homes, the libraries were stolen with them. How many griots died in the hulls of slave ships? How many genealogies ended in the bottom of the Atlantic? When the chain of oral transmission is snapped, even for one generation, the history evaporates. It is the ultimate lost epoch, because we don't even know what we lost. But Africa didn't just have oral history. It had stone, and it had scripts. And the silence surrounding them is even more baffling. Let's go to Sudan, just south of Egypt. Here lies the kingdom of Kush. For a long time, early Egyptologists treated Kush as a poor copy of Egypt. They saw the pyramids in the desert of Meroe and dismissed them as provincial imitations. But look closer. These pyramids are different. They are steeper, sharper, and there are more of them. And the people who built them weren't imitators. For a century, they were the masters. Around 744 BCE, the Kushite kings conquered Egypt. This was the 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs. Rulers like Pi and Taharqa didn't just sit on the throne in Thebes. They reunited a chaotic Egypt and sparked a massive artistic renaissance. They were the superpower of the Nile. Yet for decades in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Western textbooks barely mentioned them. The racism of the time couldn't accept that black Africans had ruled the civilized Egyptians. They were written out of the story, treated as a brief, embarrassing interlude. But the Kushites left behind something that proves their intellectual independence: the Meroitic script. While they used Egyptian hieroglyphs for a while, around 300 BCE, they developed their own writing system. It has an alphabet of 23 signs. We have found it carved on temple walls and written on offering tables. Here is the tragedy. We can read the letters, but we can't understand the words. We know the sounds. We can read a name like Queen Amanirenas, but we don't know the grammar. We don't know the vocabulary. It is a linguistic locked room. Because the Meroitic language died out and was replaced by Nubian and later Arabic, we have no bridge to cross the gap. Scholars are still arguing over which language family it even belongs to. Is it Nilo-Saharan? Is it Afro-Asiatic? Until we find a bilingual text, a Kushite Rosetta Stone, the internal thoughts, the poetry, and the laws of this massive African empire will remain silence. We are staring at the pages of a book we cannot read, written by a people we tried to forget. If the silence of Kush was caused by a language we can't read, the silence of Great Zimbabwe was caused by a story we refused to hear. Deep in the heart of southern Africa, in the modern nation of Zimbabwe, lies one of the most breathtaking ruins on the planet. It is a city of stone that rises out of the savannah like a fortress of giants. The name itself, Zimbabwe, comes from the Shona phrase Dzimba Dza Mabwe, meaning houses of stone. And that is exactly what they are. The centerpiece is the Great Enclosure. It is a massive elliptical wall, 36 feet high and 20 feet thick. It is built from nearly 1 million blocks of granite. But the true marvel is the engineering. There is no mortar. There is no cement holding these stones together. They are dry stone masonry, cut and stacked with such terrifying precision that they have stood for 700 years without glue. Inside the walls, there is a conical tower, 30 feet high, shaped like a grain silo, but solid stone. The acoustics of the enclosure are so perfect that a voice spoken at one end can be heard at the other. At its peak, around 1400 CE, this city was home to 18,000 people. It wasn't a lonely outpost, it was a global hub. When archaeologists sifted through the dirt, before the tragedy I'm about to tell you about, they found Ming Dynasty porcelain from China, colored glass beads from India, and coins from the Arab world. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a wealthy trading empire that moved gold and ivory from the African interior to the Indian Ocean coast, linking the savannah to the Silk Road. It was African, it was sophisticated, and it was undeniable. But when European explorers stumbled upon it in the 19th century, they couldn't handle the truth. In 1871, a German explorer named Karl Mauch arrived at the ruins. He looked at the towering granite walls, he looked at the intricate chevron patterns carved into the stone, and then he looked at the local Shona people living in mud huts nearby. And he made a deduction that would poison African history for a century. He decided that the Africans could not have built this. Mauch wrote in his diary that the ruins must be a copy of Solomon's temple. He claimed it was the biblical city of Ophir, or the palace of the Queen of Sheba. He decided it had to be the work of a lost white race, Phoenicians or Jews or Arabs, anyone but the indigenous black population. This wasn't just a bad academic theory, it became a political weapon. When Cecil Rhodes conquered the region and founded the colony of Rhodesia, this fake history became the justification for white rule. The logic was twisted but effective. If white people, Phoenicians, built this great civilization in the past, then white people have a historical right to rule this land today. The Africans are just squatters. To protect this lie, the colonial authorities committed a crime against history. In 1902, a journalist named Richard Hall was appointed as the curator of Great Zimbabwe. Hall was not an archaeologist, he was a propagandist. His job was to prove the ancient Semitic origin of the site. Hall decided that the site was contaminated by layers of African filth. He believed that if he dug deep enough, he would find the real Phoenician city underneath. So, he ordered a massive cleanup. He took workers and stripped away up to 12 feet of archaeological deposits from the great enclosure. He dug up the floors, the pottery shards, the gold ornaments, and the charcoal remains of the people who actually lived there, and he threw it all on the trash heap. He destroyed the stratigraphy. He erased the chronological record. He threw away the evidence of centuries of Shona occupation because he considered it rubbish that was hiding the White City. Of course, he never found the White City. He dug down to the bedrock and found nothing, just more African stone. By the time real archaeologists like Gertrude Caton Thompson arrived in 1929 and proved conclusively that the site was entirely African in origin, the damage was done. The physical history of the daily life of Great Zimbabwe, what they ate, how their pottery evolved, how their trade networks grew, had been shoveled onto a spoil tip by a man blinded by racism. This is a different kind of lost epoch. It wasn't lost to time or nature. It was stolen. The gap in our knowledge of Great Zimbabwe is a scar left by the deliberate erasure of a people's achievement. We can still admire the walls, but we have to listen very hard to hear the voices that Richard Hall tried to silence. While the Black Pharaohs were ruling the Nile and Great Zimbabwe was still centuries in the future, something arguably even more mysterious was happening in the forests of West Africa, in what is now central Nigeria. It started by accident in 1928. Tin miners were digging in the Jos Plateau when they hit something hard. It wasn't a rock, and it wasn't a piece of ore. It was a face. They pulled out a terracotta head, a sculpture of fired clay. It had large triangular eyes with pierced pupils, elaborate hairstyles, and an expression of serene, intense concentration. It was hauntingly beautiful. As they kept digging, they found more. They found full figures, animals, and heads ranging from a few inches to life-sized. They had stumbled upon the debris of a culture we now call the Nok, named after the small village where the first head was found. But the Nok didn't just leave us art, they left us a technological paradox. Carbon dating places the Nok culture between roughly 1500 BCE and 500 CE. This makes them one of the earliest complex societies in West Africa. But the shock comes when you look at their tools. In most of the world, Mesopotamia, Europe, China, civilization followed a strict recipe. First, you figure out stone tools. Then you figure out copper. Then you mix copper and tin to make bronze, the Bronze Age. Finally, after thousands of years, you figure out how to smelt iron, the Iron Age. It's a progression. The Nok apparently looked at that recipe and threw it in the trash. We find Nok terracotta sculptures buried alongside iron slag and iron furnaces dating back to at least 500 BCE, possibly as early as 1000 BCE. But we find almost no copper or bronze tools. This means the Nok jumped straight from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. They skipped the intermediate steps entirely. Think about how insane that is. Smelting iron is chemically much harder than smelting copper. You need temperatures of over 1,500 degrees Celsius, 2,700 Fahrenheit. You need complex bellows, charcoal management, and flux. The Nok went from chipping rocks to mastering one of the most difficult metallurgies on the planet, seemingly overnight. Did they invent it independently? Or did the technology travel across the Sahara from Carthage or Kush? We don't know. The iron mystery remains one of the biggest debates in African archaeology. But the deeper mystery is the vacuum of context. We have the art. We have the iron slag. But we have almost nothing else. We have never found a Nok city. We haven't found a palace, a temple, or even a large settlement. The Nok seem to exist as a civilization of ghosts who made incredible art and then vanished into the bush. We don't know what they called themselves. Nok is just a modern label. We don't know if they had kings or priests. The sculptures give us hints. Many of the figures are depicted wearing elaborate necklaces and carrying scepters, which suggests hierarchy. Some are shown with physical deformities or diseases, suggesting a medical or ritual interest in healing. There is a famous sculpture type called the Thinker, a figure resting its chin on its knee, lost in thought. It radiates a deep, philosophical humanity. It reminds you that these weren't just primitive smelters, they were people with a complex inner life. But the tragedy of the Nok is that their history is being erased as we speak. Because the terracotta heads are so beautiful, they are worth a fortune on the international art market. For decades, the sites have been ruthlessly looted. Local diggers, desperate for money, tear the heads out of the ground, destroying the context. They throw away the pottery shards, the charcoal, and the iron slag, the boring stuff that tells us the date and the lifestyle, and just sell the pretty face. So, the Nok exist in museums in Paris and New York as disembodied objects. We can look at them, but we can't learn from them. They are like pages torn out of a diary. We can admire the handwriting, but we have lost the story. Did they influence the later glorious art of Ife and Benin? Almost certainly. But the connective tissue, the centuries between the Nok and the Ife, is a gap we are struggling to bridge. Leave the forests and the iron furnaces of Africa behind. We are going to step off the edge of the map. We are going to the place that terrified European sailors even in the age of gunpowder, the Pacific. To understand the Lost Epoch of the Pacific, you first have to grasp the sheer, terrifying scale of the stage. The Pacific Ocean covers 64 million square miles. It is larger than all the Earth's land masses combined. You could fit every continent inside it and still have room for another Africa. It is the Blue Void. For most of human history, this ocean was a barrier. It was the end of the world. But around 3,000 years ago, while the Greeks were still figuring out how to sail across the bathtub, that is the Aegean Sea, a group of people in Southeast Asia looked at that endless blue horizon and said, "Let's go." This was the last great human migration. And it wasn't an accident. They didn't just drift on logs. They were the astronauts of the Neolithic. Their spaceship was the double-hulled canoe. Forget the little dugout canoes you see in movies. These were massive, ocean-going catamarans, some over 100 feet long. By lashing two hulls together, they created a vessel that was incredibly stable. It couldn't capsize like a European ship, and had a massive deck for cargo, pigs, chickens, and families. They were faster than Captain Cook's ships, able to surf down the faces of ocean swells at 20 knots. But the hardware is the easy part to understand. The software is where the history gets lost. How do you navigate 2,000 miles of open ocean from Tahiti to Hawaii without a compass, a sextant, or a chart? If you miss your target by 50 miles in the Pacific, you don't just get lost, you die. You drift until you starve. The Polynesians solved this with a mental technology that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. They didn't use instruments. They became the instrument. The master navigator sat on the deck, and in his mind he held a star compass. He had memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars. He knew that if he kept the canoe pointed at the rising point of Altair, he was heading northeast. When Altair rose too high, he switched to the next star. He created a moving pathway of light across the sky. But what happens during the day, or when it's cloudy? This is where the lost knowledge gets truly sensory. The navigator learned to read the ocean itself. They could feel the swells, the deep, rhythmic waves generated by distant trade winds. These swells move across the ocean like a pulse. When a swell hits an island, it bounces back, creating a specific interference pattern. There is a famous, slightly earthy description from the oral traditions that says a true navigator could feel the testicles of the sea. By sitting on the wooden deck, sensitive to every vibration, he could distinguish between the main swell, the reflected swell from a distant island, and the chop of the local wind. He could literally feel an island hundreds of miles away by the way it disrupted the rhythm of the boat under his butt. They read the clouds. They knew that a certain tint of green on the underside of a cloud meant a lagoon was reflecting up at it. They read the birds. If you see a frigate bird, you are within 60 miles of land. If you see a tern, you are within 20. This was a comprehensive scientific understanding of the natural world. But here is the tragedy. It was never written down. It was passed from master to apprentice through song. The star maps were songs. The lists of islands were chants. You had to memorize the entire database of the Pacific Ocean before you were allowed to command a canoe. So, what happens when the voyages stop? By the time Captain Cook and the Europeans arrived in the 18th century, the golden age of Polynesian expansion was already fading. The great long-distance voyages, the trips from Tahiti to Hawaii or to New Zealand, had become rare or had stopped entirely in some places. The long pause had set in. The reasons are debated. Climate change, the little ice age making the seas rougher, resource exhaustion, or social shifts. But the result was a catastrophic loss of data. When the old navigators died without training a new generation, because the islands were no longer trading with each other, the star compass began to dissolve. The mental maps that connected the archipelagos were forgotten. Islands that had once been neighbors, visiting each other regularly, became isolated worlds. They forgot each other existed. Cook met a Tahitian navigator named Tupaia, who could draw a map of the Pacific from memory that included 130 islands across a 2,000-mile radius. Cook was astounded. Tupaia was a living relic of the old web, but Tupaia died of malaria in Batavia, and his knowledge largely died with him. For 200 years, Western historians assumed the Polynesians had just drifted to the islands by luck, because they couldn't believe savages could navigate better than the Royal Navy. It wasn't until the 1970s, with the construction of the Hokulea and the revival of wayfinding, that we proved it was possible. We realized that we had been looking at a civilization that had conquered the largest feature on Earth using nothing but wood, fiber, and the human mind, and then quietly let the knowledge slip into the waves. Deep in the Micronesian Pacific, thousands of miles from the massive continents, lies a place that feels less like a city and more like a hallucination. It is called Nan Madol. If you sail to the island of Pohnpei today, you will find a humid, lush, volcanic island. But off its eastern shore, rising directly out of the shallow lagoon, is a ghost city made of stone. This isn't a city built on an island. It is a city built as an island, or rather, 92 artificial islands. Between 1200 and 1500 CE, while the cathedrals of Europe were rising, the Saudeleur dynasty of Pohnpei decided to do something insane. They built a Venice in the middle of the Pacific. But unlike Venice, which is built of brick and wood, Nan Madol is built of massive, volcanic basalt logs. I say logs, but they are stone. When volcanic lava cools in a certain way, it fractures into perfect hexagonal columns. You might have seen this at the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. The builders of Nan Madol quarried these natural stone pillars, some 20 feet long and weighing up to 50 tons, and stacked them crisscross like a giant game of Lincoln logs. The scale is stupefying. Archaeologists estimate the city contains 750,000 tons of black rock. Now, pause. Pohnpei had no metal tools, no pulleys, no cranes, no draft animals. And the quarry for these stones was on the other side of the main island, miles away. How do you move a 50-ton stone column from a mountain quarry, drag it through a dense jungle, float it across a lagoon, and then lift it 25 feet into the air to stack it on a wall? If you try to float basalt on a bamboo raft, the raft sinks. If you try to drag it through the mud, you get stuck. The local oral history has a very simple explanation. Magic. They say two sorcerer brothers, Olisipa and Olosopa, arrived in a large canoe and used their magic to make the heavy stones fly through the air like birds and settle into place. When archaeologists hear magic, they usually roll their eyes. But in this case, the magic is a placeholder for a lost technology. Just like the Coral Castle in Florida or the pyramids of Egypt, we are missing the specific engineering trick, perhaps a unique method of leverage or massive temporary causeways, or a way of using the tides that made the impossible possible. The how is a gap in the record. But the why is even more unsettling. Nan Madol wasn't a city for the people. It was a city for the ghosts and the captives. It was designed as a ritual center and a royal residence. The Saudeleur rulers forced the local chiefs to live in the city. It sounds like a courtly honor, but it was actually a brilliant political trap. By keeping his potential rivals close, where he could watch them, the king prevented rebellions. It was a golden cage made of basalt. Life in Nan Madol would have been difficult. There is no fresh water on the artificial islands. Every drop of water and every scrap of food had to be canoed in from the main island by servants. It was a city of absolute dependence. The atmosphere today is undeniably spooky. The city was abandoned around 1628, likely after the overthrow of the tyrannical Saudaleur rulers by a warrior named Isokalekel. The legend says Isokalekel was a semi-mythical hero who instituted a new, more decentralized rule. When the tyrant fell, the people walked away. They left the massive stone log cabins to the mangroves. Today the canals are choked with silt and roots. The silence is heavy. The basalt columns are black and wet, absorbing the tropical heat. You can paddle a canoe through the streets, looking up at walls that rival medieval castles, and realize that you are looking at the skeleton of a leviathan. Why build a city in the water? Some fringe theorists love to scream, "Atlantis!" They claim it's a remnant of a lost continent. But the truth is more grounded and more human. It was an ultimate display of dominance. To force your people to move a mountain into the sea is the ultimate flex. It says, I control nature, and I control you. But when the control broke, the city died. The Pohnpeios returned to the main island, to the fresh water and the fertile soil. They left the stone city to the spirits. Today, many locals still refuse to go there after dark. They say the spirits of the Saudaleurs still haunt the basalt, angry that their great machine of power was turned off. Nan Madol stands as a monument to the fact that just because you can build something massive doesn't mean it's sustainable. It was a feat of engineering that required a level of social oppression that eventually snapped. And when it snapped, the jungle was waiting to take it back. From Nan Madol, we sail southeast, deeper into the void, until we hit the loneliest place on Earth, Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. If you look at it on a globe, it's a speck of dust in an empty room. It is 1,200 miles from the nearest inhabited island, Pitcairn, and 2,300 miles from the coast of Chile. Once the Polynesians arrived here, probably around 1200 CE, they were effectively on another planet. There was no going back, and in that isolation, they created something that has obsessed the world ever since. The Moai. You know the image, the giant stone heads with the brooding brows and the tight lips. There are nearly 1,000 of them. Some are over 30 feet tall and weigh 80 tons. The standard story you've probably heard is a morality play about eco-suicide. It goes like this. The islanders became obsessed with building bigger and bigger statues to honor their ancestors. To move the statues, they needed wood for rollers and levers. So they cut down the trees. They cut down all the trees. When the last tree fell, the soil washed away. The crops failed. The people couldn't build canoes to fish or escape. They got trapped in a prison of their own making. War broke out. They toppled the statues. They ate each other. It's a grim fable called ecocide, popularized by Jared Diamond. But recently, archaeologists have started to rewrite that story. And the new version is less about stupidity and more about tragedy. The rat theory suggests that while humans cut down trees, the real culprit was the Polynesian rat, which came along for the ride. With no predators, the rats multiplied into the millions and ate the palm nuts, preventing the forest from regenerating. The deforestation was a slow-motion biological accident, not a chainsaw massacre. But the biggest gap in the Easter Island story isn't about trees, it's about words. Rapa Nui is the only place in the entire Pacific where we found a potential script. It's called Rongorongo. In the 1860s, a French bishop stumbled upon wooden tablets covered in strange, carved glyphs. They show little men, birds, fish, and geometric shapes arranged in lines. It is unique. It looks like nothing else in Polynesia, and to this day we cannot read it. Is it a true language? A memory aid for chanting? A copy of Spanish writing seen on a treaty? If it is a true independent invention of writing, it would be one of the rarest events in human history. So why can't we ask the locals? Because of the Peruvian slavers. In 1862, a fleet of slave ships from Peru arrived at the island. They didn't want statues. They wanted bodies to work the guano mines on the Chincha Islands. They kidnapped over 1,000 people, about half the population. Critically, they took the king, his family, and the Maori, the learned class of priests and scholars who knew the traditions. It was a death sentence. Most of the islanders died in the brutal mines of Peru. When international pressure forced the slavers to return the survivors, only about 15 made it back alive, and they brought smallpox with them. The resulting epidemic reduced the population of Rapa Nui to 111 people. Pause. 111 people. That is the bottleneck through which the entire culture had to squeeze. Among the dead were all the men who knew how to read the Rongorongo tablets. The key to the library died in a guano mine or a sickbed in the 1860s. When later researchers asked the survivors what the tablets said, they didn't know. They used the sacred wooden boards to wrap fishing lines or burn for firewood. The Moai are the face of the island, but the Rongorongo is its lost voice. We can look at the statues and guess about the ancestors, but the actual words of the people who built them, their prayers, their genealogies, their history, are locked inside those little wooden glyphs, silent forever because of a single raid in 1862. You might think that the greatest evidence for lost history is a giant stone pyramid or a golden mask. But sometimes the most undeniable proof of a lost epoch is sitting on your dinner plate at Thanksgiving. It's the sweet potato. This humble, lumpy tuber is an archaeological smoking gun. Here is the botanical reality. The sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, is native to the Americas. Specifically, it evolved in the Andes of South America. It does not grow naturally anywhere else. Yet, when Captain Cook arrived in Tahiti, New Zealand, and Easter Island in the 1700s, what did he find the locals eating? Sweet potatoes. In fact, it was a staple crop across the entire Polynesian triangle. Now, sweet potatoes do not float. If you throw one in the ocean, it gets waterlogged and rots within days. It cannot drift 4,000 miles on a current and plant itself on a beach in Hawaii. It requires a human hand. It requires a boat. So we are left with two possibilities. Either South Americans built rafts and drifted west, which is what Thor Heyerdahl tried to prove with his famous Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947, or, and this is the far more likely scenario, the Polynesians, the greatest navigators on Earth, didn't stop at Easter Island. They kept going. They hit the wall of the world, the Andes. The evidence isn't just botanical, it is linguistic. And this is the part that gives you chills. In the Quechua language of the Andes, the language of the Incas, the word for sweet potato is kumar or kumara. In the Maori language of New Zealand, thousands of miles away across the open ocean, the word for sweet potato is kumara. That is not a coincidence. That is a loan word. That is a receipt. It implies a moment of contact that is almost impossible to visualize, but clearly happened. Picture a double-hulled canoe, exhausted after weeks at sea, pulling up onto a beach in modern-day Ecuador or Colombia around 1200 CE. The Polynesians step off. The locals step forward. They trade. They share food. The Polynesians give the South Americans chickens, which also appear in South America before Columbus. The South Americans give the Polynesians the kumara. And then the Polynesians get back in their boats and sail home, planting this new miracle crop on every island they touch. For decades, Western historians fought this idea. They called it pseudoscience. They insisted the ocean was a barrier, not a bridge. But in 2020, the debate was settled by the ultimate forensic witness, DNA. A massive genetic study analyzed the genomes of modern Polynesians and found unmistakable traces of Native American DNA. And not just ancient specific sequences related to the indigenous people of Colombia. The dating puts the mixing event around 1150 to 1200 CE, so we missed a Columbus moment by 300 years. The European narrative says that the Americas were isolated from the rest of the world until 1492. But the sweet potato and the DNA tell us that the Pacific was a highway. There was a time when the master navigators of the ocean shook hands with the master builders of the mountains. But here is the gap. Why isn't there a song about it? Polynesian oral tradition is incredibly detailed. They have chants that describe specific stars, specific ancestors, and specific voyages. Yet there is no widely known, definitive saga of the great mountain land. There is no clear memory of a continent. Why? Did the voyagers die on the way back, leaving only a few survivors to plant the potato? Was the land considered too hostile or too strange to revisit? Or was the story simply lost in the long pause as the islands became isolated? We have the artifact, the potato, and the blood, the DNA, but we have lost the narrative. We know that they met, but we will never know what they said to each other on that beach. We have talked about civilizations that died, regressed, or were silenced. But now I want to talk about a civilization that committed the opposite crime against history. It appeared too suddenly. We are going to the Nile Valley, around 3100 BCE. We are witnessing the birth of dynastic Egypt. When you look at the rise of most civilizations, it's a slow, messy slope. You see crude pottery slowly getting better. You see small mud huts slowly turning into brick houses. You see scratches on stone slowly evolving into an alphabet. It's a process of trial and error that takes thousands of years. But Egypt doesn't follow the rules. Egypt explodes. In the archaeological record, it feels like someone flipped a switch. One moment, you have disparate tribes living in the Nile Valley with relatively simple pottery and loose organization. The next moment, geologically speaking, you have a unified state, a god-king, the pharaoh, monumental stone architecture, and a writing system, hieroglyphs, that is already fully complex and complete. Where is the beta version of Egypt? This is the question that haunts pre-dynastic archaeologists. Where are the clumsy pyramids? Where are the hieroglyphs that are just stick figures struggling to express an idea? When we find the earliest hieroglyphs in Tomb Uj at Abydos, dated to around 3250 BCE, they aren't primitive. They are phonetic. They have grammar. They are already a system. It's as if the Egyptians showed up to the first day of school already knowing calculus. Now, pseudo-historians love this. They scream aliens or Atlantis. They say this knowledge must have been given to them by spacemen. But the answer is likely far more grounded and far more tragic. The beta version of Egypt existed, but it didn't exist in the Nile Valley. It existed in a place that is now a ghost. To understand Egypt, you have to look at the map. Today, Egypt is a green ribbon of life surrounded by a dead, yellow void. The Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert in the world. It is the definition of uninhabitable. But it wasn't always like this, and the key to the instant civilization lies in the sand dunes to the west. We know from rock art and climate data that the Sahara has a heartbeat. It breathes. Every 20,000 years or so, due to a wobble in the Earth's axis, precession, the African monsoon shifts north. The rains that currently soak the Congo rainforest move up and soak the desert. Between roughly 10,000 BCE and 5,000 BCE, the Sahara was green. It was a savanna. It was full of lakes, hippos, giraffes, and, crucially, people. This is the Green Sahara. It was a massive, fertile paradise where human culture could incubate for thousands of years. The theory is this. The trial and error phase of Egyptian civilization, the messy part we can't find in the Nile, happened out there. It happened in the Green Sahara. This is where they learned to domesticate cattle. This is where they learned astronomy, as we'll see in a minute. This is where they developed the complex religious ideas of the afterlife. But around 5000 BCE, the wobble shifted back. The Sahara pump turned off. The rains stopped. The lakes dried up. The paradise began to turn into a hellscape of wind and sand. Imagine the refugees. Millions of people, over centuries, being squeezed out of their dying homeland. They had only one place to go. They had to march east, toward the only permanent water source left, the Nile. So when we see the sudden rise of Egypt around 3100 BCE, we aren't seeing a birth. We are seeing a lifeboat. The sudden complexity was an injection. It was the result of a massive concentration of people, skills, and myths from the dying desert, all crashing into the Nile Valley at the same time. The unification of Egypt wasn't just a political event, it was a survival strategy. And there is one artifact that hints at this chaotic, violent beginning. It is the palette of Nama. It shows the first king, Nama, smiting his enemies and uniting the two lands. It is often called the first historical document in the world. But look at the imagery. It shows mythical beasts with intertwined necks, serpopods that look suspiciously Mesopotamian. It shows a level of artistic confidence that is startling. But the most chilling implication is this. The culture that built the pyramids is actually the survivor of a climate apocalypse. They built for eternity because they knew, deep in their cultural memory, how fragile the world could be. They had watched their own green world turn to dust, and they were determined that their new home on the river would last forever. To really understand where the soul of Egypt came from, you have to leave the river. You have to drive west, deep into the blistering, inhospitable wastes of the western desert. You have to drive until the GPS says you are in the middle of absolutely nowhere, about 60 miles west of Abu Simbel. Here, in a dry basin called Nab Taplaya, you will find a circle of stones standing in the sand. At first glance, it looks underwhelming. It's not Stonehenge. The stones are small, rough, and unshaped. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you would trip over them and keep walking. But these stones are the smoking gun of the Lost Epoch of the Green Sahara. Radiocarbon dating puts the construction of this site around 7000 BCE. That is 4,500 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is older than Stonehenge by millennia, and it isn't just a pile of rocks, it is a precision instrument. When astroarchaeologists mapped the site, they realized the stones were aligned to the summer solstice. But more importantly, other alignments pointed to the rising of specific stars, specifically Sirius and the Belt of Orion. If you know anything about later Egyptian mythology, the hair on the back of your neck should be standing up right now. Sirius is the star of the goddess Isis. Its rising heralded the annual flood of the Nile, the event that made life possible. Orion is associated with Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection. These are the two foundational pillars of Egyptian theology. And here they are, being tracked and worshipped in the middle of the desert, thousands of years before the first pharaoh was even born. This suggests that the Egyptian religion didn't start in Egypt. It started here. But who built it? We call them the cattle people. When we dig around Nabta Playa, we don't find the bodies of kings. We find the bodies of cows. In one specific chamber, archaeologists found an entire young cow, buried with honors, covered in rocks. This obsession with cattle makes perfect sense for a savanna culture. In the Green Sahara, cows were wealth. They were life. And this obsession clearly migrated to the Nile. Hathor, one of the oldest and most powerful Egyptian gods, is depicted as a woman with the ears of a cow, or simply as a cow. The Nama palette we just talked about. It has two massive cow heads at the top. The DNA of the desert culture is written all over the river culture. But the party at Nabta Playa couldn't last. Around 5,300 BCE, the Sahara pump began to falter. The monsoons that had kept the desert green for thousands of years started to retreat south, back toward the equator. The change wasn't instant, but it was relentless. The lakes turned into ponds. The ponds turned into mud. The mud turned into dust. Imagine the desperation of these people. You are a cattle herder. You have lived in this lush grassland for 50 generations. You know every watering hole. You know the stars. But now, the grass is crunching under your feet. The hippos are dying in the mud. The sand dunes, which used to be far to the north, are creeping closer every year, swallowing the world. You have a choice: stay and die, or move. So, the Great Migration began. It was a slow-motion funnel. Populations that had been spread out over millions of square miles of savanna were forced to compress into the only habitable strip of land left: the Nile Valley. This explains the instant complexity of Egypt. It wasn't that they learned fast. It was that they were refugees bringing their heirlooms. The people coming from the west brought the astronomy, Nabta Playa, and the cow gods, Hathor. The people perhaps coming from the east brought the grains. The people from the south brought the pottery styles. The Nile Valley became a pressure cooker. When you jam that many different tribes, technologies, and myths into a narrow canyon, you get conflict. And conflict forces organization. You need a referee. You need a king. Dynastic Egypt, in this view, is the survivor state of a climate apocalypse. It is the lifeboat that the Saharan people built when their green world turned to gold. And the pyramids? Perhaps they are artificial mountains built by a people who remembered the real mountains of their lost home, or maybe they are stylized versions of the sand dunes that chased them to the river. Historians still argue about the specifics, how much influence came from the Sahara versus the Levant. But the empty desert is no longer empty in our minds. It is the ghost of a garden. And every time you look at the Sphinx, you are looking at a monument built by the children of the Green Sahara, facing east, watching the sun rise over the river that saved them. We have been talking about lost civilizations, about cities that fell and cultures that were forgotten. But now we need to talk about a moment when the entire human species almost joined the lost list. We are going back 12,900 years. To set the scene, the world is coming out of the Ice Age. For thousands of years, the planet has been slowly warming up. The glaciers are melting, the sea levels are creeping up, and life is getting good. Humans are spreading out, hunting mammoths in North America, painting caves in Europe, and generally enjoying the thaw. It feels like spring is finally arriving after a winter that lasted 100,000 years. And then, someone slammed the freezer door shut. It happened incredibly fast. We are talking about a climate shift that didn't take centuries. Geological records suggest the temperature plummeted in less than a decade. In some places, it might have happened in a few years. Imagine living in a world that is getting warmer, and then, practically overnight, the temperature drops by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. The forests you rely on die. The herds you hunt starve. The glaciers stop melting and start advancing again, crushing the land. This period is called the Younger Dryas. It lasted for 1,200 brutal years. It was a return to full Ice Age conditions, but it hit a world that wasn't expecting it. The casualties of this big freeze were colossal. This is the moment the megafauna checked out. Before the Younger Dryas, North America was a Serengeti of monsters. There were woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths the size of tanks, and camels. Yes, camels originated in America. By the time the Younger Dryas was over, they were all gone. Extinct. 35 genera of massive mammals vanished from the Americas alone. And the humans? We barely made it. In North America, there was a culture called the Clovis people. We identify them by their beautiful, distinctively fluted stone spear points. They were the masters of the continent. But right at the start of the Younger Dryas, around 10,800 BCE, the Clovis points stop appearing in the archaeological record. They vanish. Did the people die out? Or did their society collapse so completely that they forgot how to make their signature weapons? Genetic studies suggest a bottleneck. The human population crashed. We were reduced to small, scattered bands, clinging to survival in a frozen world. But here is the most crucial part of this Lost Epoch for our story: the coastlines. During the Ice Age, because so much water was locked up in ice sheets, global sea levels were about 400 feet, 120 meters, lower than they are today. Think about what that means. It means the beach, where our ancestors lived 13,000 years ago, is now miles out to sea, under 400 feet of water. Humans have always loved the coast. It has the best food, the mildest weather, and the easiest travel. If there were sophisticated cultures during the Ice Age, if there were civilizations before the rise of Egypt and Sumer, they would have been built on the coast. But when the Younger Dryas ended and the ice melted for good, the ocean rose. It rose fast. We have evidence of meltwater pulses, catastrophic floods where sea levels jumped by meters in a lifetime. Any evidence of human settlement on the Ice Age coastlines, the wooden houses, the bone tools, the first attempts at cities, was drowned. It is now sitting on the continental shelf, buried under silt and crushed by the ocean. We look for the origins of civilization on dry land because that's where we can dig. But that is like looking for your keys under the streetlight, because the light is better there, even though you dropped them in the dark alley. The Lost Epoch of the late Ice Age isn't just lost in time. It is lost in space. It is underwater. And for a long time, mainstream archaeologists assumed that nothing important was lost. They assumed humans were just simple hunter-gatherers until the ice melted. But then, in 1994, a shepherd in Turkey noticed a strange rock sticking out of a dusty hill. And that assumption shattered. The hill is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish it means pot-belly hill. It sits in the dry, dusty landscape of southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border. For decades, it was dismissed as a medieval graveyard, but when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt started digging there in the mid-90s, he didn't find medieval graves. He found a time machine that broke history. He found massive, T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles. Some of these pillars are 18 feet tall and weigh up to 16 tons. They are beautifully carved with reliefs of animals: scorpions, boars, vultures, foxes, and lions. They are polished, stylized, and clearly the work of master craftsmen. Here is the problem. Carbon dating puts the construction of Göbekli Tepe at roughly 9,600 BCE. Let that date sink in. This is 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. It is 6,000 years before Stonehenge. In 9,600 BCE, according to the standard timeline of history, humans were supposed to be small bands of hunter-gatherers. We were supposed to be living in temporary huts, chasing gazelles, and gathering berries. We hadn't invented the wheel. We hadn't invented pottery. We hadn't even invented farming. Yet somehow these primitive nomads came together, organized a massive workforce, quarried 16-ton stones with flint tools because they had no metal, dragged them up a hill, and built the first temple in the world. It is like finding a Boeing 747 in the basement of Leonardo da Vinci. It shouldn't be there. It violates the technological tree of civilization. The sheer logistics of Göbekli Tepe are mind-boggling. To move a 16-ton stone without wheels or draft animals requires hundreds of men. You have to feed those men. You have to give them water. You need a hierarchy, someone to give orders, someone to design the layout. This implies a level of social complexity that we thought only came after agriculture. The old theory was, first you invent farming, then you get a surplus of food, then you settle down, and then you build temples. Göbekli Tepe flips that logic on its head. There is no evidence of domesticated wheat or settled villages at the site when it was first built. The bones found there are from wild gazelles, not farm animals. This suggests that religion came first. The urge to build a sacred site brought people together. And because they had to feed the massive workforce required to build the temple, they were forced to invent farming. The temple birthed the city, not the other way around. But the site is darker than just a cathedral. The imagery is aggressive. There are no depictions of happy domestic life. It is all predators. Spiders, snakes, snarling beasts. And there is a heavy focus on death. Some archaeologists believe Göbekli Tepe was a site for a skull cult. We have found fragments of human skulls that were carved and drilled, likely to be hung up for display. It may have been a place where the dead were brought to be processed, perhaps exposed to the vultures, sky burial, before their bones were interred. And then there is the geometry. In 2020, researchers using algorithms to map the pillars discovered a hidden geometric pattern. If you connect the center points of the three main stone circles, they form a nearly perfect equilateral triangle. This implies that the builders weren't just piling up rocks randomly. They had a master plan. They understood geometry and surveying thousands of years before the Greeks gave those things names. The most baffling part? After using the site for over 1,000 years, the people of Göbekli Tepe didn't just abandon it. They buried it. They deliberately carted in tons of soil and rubble and completely covered the temple complex. They erased their own masterpiece. Why? Was it a ritual closing? A rejection of the old gods? Or were they hiding it from someone? We don't know. We have excavated less than 5% of the site. Ground-penetrating radar shows there are at least 16 more stone circles still buried underground. We are just scratching the surface of the anomaly. Göbekli Tepe proves that the cavemen of the Ice Age were capable of monumental thinking. It forces us to ask, if they could build this, what else did they build that we haven't found yet? So, we are staring at Göbekli Tepe, a cathedral built by people who shouldn't have been able to build a shed. And this brings us to the most dangerous, seductive, and controversial idea in archaeology, the Lost Civilization hypothesis. You might know this as the Graham Hancock territory. It's the idea that there was a sophisticated, possibly global civilization that existed during the Ice Age, which was destroyed by the Younger Dryas cataclysm, leaving only scattered refugees to pass on their knowledge to places like Egypt and Sumer. Now, we have to be very careful here. As a rule, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And right now, we don't have a smoking gun. We don't have an Ice Age plastic bottle or a microchip. But Göbekli Tepe forces even the most conservative skeptics to admit something uncomfortable. We are missing a chapter. You don't just wake up one morning, grab a piece of flint, and carve a perfect 3D relief of a lion on a limestone pillar. Art, engineering, and masonry are skills that evolve. They require practice. They require a developmental phase. Where are the beta versions of Göbekli Tepe? Where are the clumsy, smaller stone circles that should have come before the masterpiece? They don't seem to exist. Göbekli Tepe appears fully formed, perfect, and massive right from the start. This suggests two possibilities. Possibility 1, the Wood Age. Perhaps for thousands of years before Göbekli Tepe, humans were building massive, complex temples out of wood. They were carving totem poles as intricate as the stone pillars. They were building timber cathedrals. But because wood rots, that entire history has dissolved. Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of something. It's the moment they decided to switch materials. It's the moment they decided to make their wooden ideas permanent in stone, perhaps because they sensed the world was changing. Possibility 2, the Atlantis archetype. I'm not talking about a magical city with flying cars. I'm talking about the coastal civilizations we mentioned earlier. Remember the sea level rise? If the teachers of Göbekli Tepe came from a culture that lived on the Ice Age coastlines, their cities are now underwater. We might be looking at the refugees of a drowned world retreating to the highlands of Turkey and trying to rebuild what they lost. This isn't just pure fantasy. We have sites that hint at this submerged history. Take Gunung Padang in Indonesia. On the surface, it looks like a hill covered in columnar basalt blocks. But recent and controversial scans suggest the hill itself might be artificial, a pyramid-like structure that could date back 20,000 years. If true, and it is a big if, it would rewrite history completely. Or look at Dwarka in India. Ancient Hindu texts describe a glorious city of Lord Krishna that was swallowed by the sea. For centuries, it was considered a myth. Then, marine archaeologists found ruins, stone walls, pottery, and anchors submerged off the coast of modern Gujarat. We have to consider the possibility that the Atlantis myth isn't a story about a specific magical island, but a collective cultural memory of the global trauma of sea level rise. Every culture has a flood myth. Maybe that's because every culture that survived witnessed the drowning of their ancestral lands. The gap here is a gap of imagination. We have underestimated our ancestors. We assumed that because they didn't have iPads, they were stupid. But the people of the Pleistocene had brains just as big as ours. They had the same capacity for art, for awe, and for organization. Göbekli Tepe proves that they didn't need aliens to build great things. But it also suggests that what we see in the history books, Sumer, Egypt, China, might not be the first rise of civilization. It might be the restart. We might be living in Civilization 2.0, walking unknowingly over the grave of version 1.0. If we accept the possibility that a lost chapter of human history existed before 12,000 years ago, we are left with a crime scene investigation. A civilization, or at least a robust culture, doesn't just trip and fall into oblivion. Something has to push it. We know the Great Freeze of the Younger Dryas happened. That is a geological fact. But why did it happen? Why did a warming Earth suddenly plunge back into the freezer for 1,000 years? For decades, the standard answer was fresh water. Scientists believed a massive ice dam broke in North America, dumping cold water into the Atlantic and shutting down the Gulf Stream. It's a boring, plausible plumbing explanation. But recently, a new group of scientists has walked into the room and put a much scarier weapon on the table. It's called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it argues that the reset button wasn't pressed by a broken dam. It was pressed by the sky. The theory suggests that around 12,800 years ago, Earth moved into the path of a disintegrating comet. We didn't get hit by a single dinosaur-killer asteroid. We got hit by a shotgun blast. A massive comet, perhaps 100 kilometers wide, had broken up into thousands of fragments. Imagine the scene. You are standing in North America. You look up, and the sky isn't just falling. It's burning. These fragments didn't hit the ground. They hit the ice. The Laurentide ice sheet was 2 miles thick. When a bolide traveling at 60,000 miles per hour hits ice, it doesn't just make a splash. It creates an explosion equivalent to thousands of nuclear warheads. The ice is instantly vaporized into superheated steam. The evidence for this isn't just a cool story. It's in the dirt. Across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, archaeologists have found a distinct, thin layer in the soil. It's called the black mat. Below this black line you find mammoth bones, Clovis spear points, and pollen from a lush world. Above the line, nothing. No mammoths, no Clovis, just dust and wind. But it's what is inside the black mat that counts. When you put this dirt under an electron microscope, you find things that shouldn't be there. You find nanodiamonds. These are microscopic diamonds that only form under pressures and temperatures so extreme they don't exist naturally on Earth's surface. You find magnetic spherules, tiny balls of rock that melted and rained back down. And most damningly, you find a massive spike in platinum. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust, but it is very common in comets. The data suggests that 10% of the Earth's surface was set on fire. The impact would have ejected so much dust, ash, and steam into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun. This explains the freeze. The sun went dark, the plants died, the megafauna starved, and the temperatures plummeted. But before the freeze, there was the water. If you vaporize and melt a chunk of the ice sheet the size of a country, that water has to go somewhere. This leads to the global flood connection. Almost every ancient culture on Earth has a myth about a great flood. We usually treat these as separate fairy tales. The Bible has Noah. The Epic of Gilgamesh has Utnapishtim. The Greeks have Deucalion. The Gunwingu of Australia have a flood myth. The Native Americans have flood myths. Why? Why does everyone remember the same nightmare? Maybe it's because everyone experienced the same trauma. If the impact hypothesis is true, the sea levels would have risen violently and suddenly. Coastal civilizations, the Atlantis types we theorized about, would have been wiped out in a single day. And then there is the fire. The Norse mythology of Ragnarok describes the Fimbul winter, a terrible winter that lasts for 3 years with no summer. But it ends with the world being consumed by the fire giant Surtur, fire and ice. The exact recipe of the Younger Dryas impact. Is it possible that these myths are not inventions, but memories? Are they the garbled, terrified oral histories of the survivors who watched the sky turn white and the oceans rise? This event acts as a format C for human history. If there was a civilization before this, one that used wood, lived on the coast, and mapped the stars, it was erased. The fires burned their libraries. The floods drowned their cities. The glaciers crushed their foundations. The only people who survived were the ones who were lucky, or the ones who were already tough enough to live in the margins. The hunter-gatherers, the people hiding in caves. We are the descendants of those survivors, and deep in our collective psyche, we still carry the scar. It's why we are afraid of the dark. It's why we are obsessed with the end of the world. We know deep down that civilization is fragile because we have seen it die before. The gap at the end of the Ice Age isn't empty space. It is a crime scene where the evidence was washed away by the greatest cataclysm in human memory. We have spent the last hour acting like detectives, looking at the holes in the map and trying to guess what used to be there. We've looked at the known unknowns, the gaps we can see, like the indecipherable script of the Indus Valley or the abandoned kivas of Chaco Canyon. We know something is missing because we can see the empty space where it used to be. But now, we have to confront the most unsettling thought of all, the unknown unknowns. What about the civilizations that left no trace? History, as we understand it, is not a fair record of what happened. It is a lottery. It is heavily biased in favor of two things: stone and deserts. If you are a civilization that loves to build with granite, and you live in a place where it never rains, like Egypt, you win. Your history survives for 5,000 years. We know your name, your king's favorite food, and your cat's name. But what if you are a civilization that loves to build with wood, bamboo, or animal skins? And what if you live in a rainforest, or a temperate valley, or a coastline? You lose. Wood rots, skins decay, bones dissolve in acidic soil. If a culture as sophisticated as the Romans had built exclusively in oak and lived in the Amazon, there would be absolutely nothing left of them today. No Colosseum, no roads, no statues, just a layer of slightly darker dirt. We call this the bias of preservation. It creates a distorted map of the past, where we think civilization equals stone. We assume the stone builders were the smartest, the most advanced, and the most important. But that's just because they are the only ones left in the room. Imagine a culture in the Pacific Northwest of America, like the ancestors of the Haida or the Tlingit. We know they created stunningly complex totem poles, massive longhouses, and intricate social hierarchies. But they built in cedar. A cedar pole lasts, 100 years in the rain? 200? If a pandemic wiped them out 5,000 years ago, we wouldn't have a clue they ever existed. We would just find a few stone arrowheads and assume they were simple nomads. We have to admit the possibility that the Lost Epochs aren't just gaps between the peaks of history. They might be the majority of history. Humans, anatomically modern humans with brains exactly like yours, have been walking around for roughly 300,000 years. History, the part where we write things down, is only about 5,000 years old. That means for 295,000 years, 98% of our existence, we were doing something. Were we just sitting in caves staring at the wall for 3,000 centuries? Or were we building empires of wood, singing songs of complex philosophy, and mapping the stars on leather charts that have long since turned to dust? Geologists have a term called the boring billion, to describe a period in Earth's history when nothing much seemed to happen. But in human terms, those 295,000 years were the silent eon. It wasn't silent because nothing was happening. It was silent because the recorder wasn't turned on. And this brings us to the hubris of the present. We look back at the Romans or the Mayans and think, oh, what a shame. They fell. They lost their knowledge. Good thing that can't happen to us. We feel permanent. We have the internet. We have the cloud. We have servers backed up in bunkers. How could we ever have a lost epoch again? But consider this. We are actually living in one of the most fragile information ages in history. A clay tablet from Babylon is practically indestructible. You can burn it, bury it, or drown it, and it will still be readable in 4,000 years. A stone stele from Egypt? It takes a lot of effort to destroy it. But a hard drive? A server? If you lose power for 50 years, the magnetic charge on a hard drive dissipates. The data corrupts. The plastic degrades. If a future archaeologist digs up a USB stick in the year 5000, they won't find the Library of Congress. They will find a piece of useless plastic. We call this the digital dark age. We are creating more data than any generation in history, but we are storing it on the most ephemeral mediums ever invented. We don't carve our victories in stone anymore. We post them on servers owned by companies that might go bankrupt in a decade. We don't write our diaries on vellum. We write them in the cloud. If our civilization were to suffer a systems collapse, like the Bronze Age, if the power went out and the supply chains broke, our history wouldn't last nearly as long as the Romans. Our skyscrapers are made of glass and steel. Steel rusts, glass shatters. Without constant maintenance, a modern city turns into a skeleton of rust in about 200 years. So in a way, we are closer to the Lost Epochs than we like to admit. We are walking a tightrope over the same abyss that swallowed the Harappans and the Sea Peoples. The only difference is that we are looking at our phones while we walk, assuming the net will always be there. It's easy to feel a sense of melancholy when you look at all these gaps. The burned libraries, the silenced voices, the drowned cities. It feels like we arrived at the party too late, after all the good stories were told and the guests had already left. But I want to flip that feeling on its head. Because the truth is, if you love history, there has never been a better time to be alive than right now. We are currently living through a golden age of archaeology that rivals the discovery of King Tut's tomb. For the last century, archaeology was a game of luck. You grabbed a shovel, walked into the desert, and hoped you didn't die of malaria before you hit a wall. It was slow, it was destructive. You have to break the ground to see what's in it. And it was blind. But today, we have taken off the blindfold. We have new tools that allow us to see the invisible. The biggest game changer is LIDAR. We've mentioned it a few times tonight, but I want you to understand just how magical this technology is. Imagine you are flying a plane over the densest jungle in Guatemala. Below you, there is only a solid green carpet of trees. You can't see 10 feet into it. But with LIDAR, you shoot millions of laser pulses per second at the ground. Some of those pulses slip through the gaps in the leaves, hit the dirt, and bounce back. A computer then digitally deletes the trees. The result is a naked map of the Earth. And what we are seeing is shocking. Where we thought there was just empty jungle, we are seeing causeways, irrigation canals, watchtowers, and thousands of house foundations. In the Maya lowlands alone, LIDAR has revealed over 60,000 previously unknown structures in just the last few years. It turns out the Maya civilization was 3 or 4 times larger than we thought. We aren't just finding new buildings, we are finding entirely new kinds of cities. We are realizing that the gaps on the map weren't empty space, they were just hidden by the canopy. Then there is the revolution of a DNA, or ancient DNA. Until recently, bones were just objects. We measured them to see how tall someone was. Now, we grind them up and read their source code. This has allowed us to find ghost populations, groups of humans that don't exist anymore and left no archaeological trace, but whose DNA lives on inside us. For example, we discovered the ancient North Eurasians, a massive population that lived in Siberia 20,000 years ago. They are the ancestors of both modern Europeans and Native Americans, yet we haven't found a single one of their cities. We only know they existed because the genetic math demands it. We are tracing migrations that were invisible. We know exactly who slept with whom, who conquered whom, and who migrated where, even if they never wrote it down. The blood is the archive. And what about the silence of the scripts? The undeciphered codes of the Indus Valley, the Minoans, Linear A, and the Proto-Elamites. This is where artificial intelligence is entering the chat. AI is really good at one thing: finding patterns in chaos. Pattern recognition is the essence of translation. Researchers are currently training deep learning models on these ancient scripts, feeding them every known symbol and letting the AI look for statistical relationships that the human eye misses. We are on the verge of a breakthrough. It is entirely possible that within our lifetimes, an AI will spit out the translation for the Indus script. Imagine the moment when the silence of Mohenjo-Daro is finally broken, and we hear the actual names of their gods and the jokes of their merchants for the first time in 4,000 years. But the final frontier isn't in a computer or a jungle. It's underwater. Remember the lost coastlines of the Ice Age, the Atlantis territories? For the first time, we have the robotics to go there cheaply. Marine archaeology used to be incredibly expensive. You needed a massive ship and a diving team. Now, we have autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, drones that can scour the seafloor for weeks, mapping every bump and anomaly. We are mapping Doggerland, the massive landmass that used to connect England to Europe before it was drowned by the rising North Sea. Fishermen there have been dragging up mammoth tusks and harpoons for years. Now we are mapping the riverbeds and the hunting camps that are sitting at the bottom of the ocean. We are realizing that the continental shelves are the biggest museum on Earth. They are untouched. Unlike land sites which have been built over, looted, and plowed by farmers for millennia, the underwater sites are sealed in a time capsule of silt. And finally, there is the democratization of discovery. You don't need a PhD to find a lost city anymore. You need an internet connection. There is a growing movement of citizen archaeologists who spend their weekends scouring Google Earth satellite imagery, looking for anomalies in the desert or strange shapes in the steppe. In 2011, an amateur researcher named Angela Mikol found 2 potential pyramid complexes in Egypt just by looking at Google Earth. Professional archaeologists were skeptical, but ground surveys confirmed there was something there. The gaps are shrinking. The light is getting brighter. We used to think of history as a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Now we realize the pieces are just under the sofa, or under the water, or hidden in the jungle, and we finally have the flashlight to find them. So don't despair for the Lost Epochs. Be excited, because the story of humanity isn't finished. In fact, we are just starting to read the good parts. We have traveled a long, strange road tonight. We started by descending into the crushing blackness of the ocean, and we have ended up staring at the stars through the lens of a satellite. In between, we walked through the burning gates of the Bronze Age, wandered the silent, sanitized streets of Mohenjo-Daro, and stood in the shadow of the pyramids that the Green Sahara built. We have seen that the story of humanity is not the clean, upward, straight line we like to draw in textbooks. It is a jagged scar. It is a heartbeat monitor that spikes with genius and flatlines with catastrophe. We have seen that civilization is fragile. It is a house of cards that can be knocked over by a shift in the trade winds, a microscopic bacterium, or a single rock falling from the sky. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that the universe tends toward entropy, toward disorder. Chaos is the natural state of things. Order is the exception. Every city, every library, and every law code is a temporary rebellion against the laws of physics. But if there is one thing this journey should teach you, it isn't fear, it's respect, and more importantly, hope. Because while we have seen the lost epochs, we have also seen the found epochs. We have seen that even when the knowledge is lost, the spark isn't. The Greeks forgot how to write Linear B, but they invented the alphabet and wrote the Odyssey. The survivors of the Mississippi collapse didn't build more mounds, but they built the complex, resilient societies of the Osage and the Creek. The Polynesians might have stopped the long voyages, but they kept the potato, a living souvenir of the time they touched the edge of the world. There is a scholarly debate that historians love to have late at night. Is history cyclical or linear? Do we just repeat the same mistakes, the same wars, the same resource traps, over and over again? Or are we actually moving somewhere new? Looking at the gaps, you might argue it's a cycle. We build, we forget, we rebuild. But looking at the whole picture, it feels more like a spiral. We come back to the same place, but we are a little higher up. We have better tools. We have deeper memories. We are the first civilization in history that is actively trying to remember the ones that failed. We are the first to dig up the vitrified walls of Hattusa and ask, what went wrong? We are the first to look at the ice cores and say, how do we stop the climate from breaking us like it broke the Harappans? There is a quirky, slightly ironic fact about time capsules. In the 1930s and 50s, people loved burying time capsules for the future. But archaeologists have found that the vast majority of them are lost within 50 years. We forget where we buried them, or the map gets thrown away. It seems that the harder we try to force the future to remember us, the faster they forget. The things that last aren't the things we try to save. They are the things we leave behind by accident. The trash, the broken pottery, the pollen in the mud, the dark earth. So when you look at a ruin, whether it's a photograph of Stonehenge or an old abandoned farmhouse down the road, don't just see a dead thing. Don't just see a pile of rocks. See a question mark. Every ruin is a ghost story waiting for a listener. It's a gap in the fabric of time that invites you to step in. It's a reminder that the people who lived there were just as real, just as anxious, and just as clever as you are. They watched the sun go down and worried about tomorrow. They loved their children and feared the dark. And speaking of the dark, I want to leave you with one final image. Imagine a campfire at night. It's a small, crackling circle of yellow light in a vast, endless plain of darkness. That fire is what we know. It is our recorded history. It is the pharaohs, the Caesars, and the presidents. It is the books in the library. It is the light of the campfire that lets us see each other's faces. But the darkness surrounding the fire, that is the Lost Epoch. It is the billions of lives lived in the shadows. It is the wood builders, the oral poets, the travelers who left no footprints. For a long time we were afraid of that darkness. We pretended it wasn't there. But tonight, we stepped out of the light. We walked into the dark. And we found that it wasn't empty. It was full of echoes. The past is not a straight line. It is a ruin, a ghost story, and a miracle. And the fact that we are here, sitting by the fire, telling the tale, means that we are the survivors. We are the ones who made it through the bottleneck. And now, the journey is over. The fire burns low, turning from bright yellow to a deep, glowing red. The sparks drift up into the night sky and fade, one by one, until they are indistinguishable from the stars. Let the dust of the centuries settle. We have moved mountains tonight, crossed oceans, and walked through the ashes of empires. But all of that is behind you now. The history books are closed, the ruins are silent. The archaeologists have put down their brushes and gone home. You are back in the safety of your own time. You are back in the comfort of your own room. The walls around you are solid. The roof is sound. The world outside is quiet. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, just as the stones of the ancient cities sank into the earth. But unlike them, you are warm, you are soft, you are at rest. Let your mind drift away from the dates and the names. Let the complexities of the Bronze Age and the mysteries of the Ice Age dissolve like mist in the morning sun. You don't need to solve any more puzzles tonight. You don't need to decipher any more scripts. There is a peace in knowing that the past is unchangeable. It rests, quiet and complete, waiting for us to visit, but demanding nothing from us now. The Lost Epochs are safe in the keeping of the earth, and you are safe in the keeping of the night. Breathe in the stillness. Breathe out the noise. The timeline blurs, the centuries fade. There is only this moment. There is only the dark, velvety wrap of sleep. Drift, float, rest.